And welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale. And just wanted to pick up from where we left off on the first premise of our cosmological argument, arguing that the universe exists contingently. And we were looking at last time in the last part, we were looking at proving aspect number 2 of premise 1, that the universe is a contingent thing that exists. And we provided a few arguments on that front, and we just got on to the last argument, proving that the universe is contingent via showing that it began to exist. It's not eternal, as a matter of fact. And we presented a couple of arguments. We presented the first philosophical argument on that front. This is going to be the continuation of that with the second philosophical argument on that front. So yeah, that's great. Now we can move on to the second philosophical argument. And the second philosophical argument is basically, it's a logically deductive argument from the impossibility of forming an actual infinite through successive addition, adding one element after another. So just a couple of quick notes on this argument. Number one, it's important to note that this argument is independent of our first philosophical argument. So it can assume, let's pretend actual infinites are logically coherent. They are possible, and they can and do exist in reality in our universe. Great. This argument will concede that and give that to the skeptic. Forget about what we just covered, arguing against how wrong that is. Let's pretend the skeptics and atheists are right and actual infinites can exist. This argument is independent. It doesn't matter, because it's not saying that an actual infinite can't exist. It's just saying a specific type of actual infinite, namely an actual infinite that is formed through successive addition. Those are impossible. Those can't exist. So just keep that distinction in mind. That's an important distinction. The second distinction with the first philosophical argument above is that this is a time theory dependent argument. So this argument only works if we assume the A theory of time is true, or the tensed or dynamic theory of time. If the B theory, or the otherwise known as the static or tenseless theory of time, is true, then this argument is a total failure. It doesn't work. So obviously we're going to, as part of the argument, we're going to have to establish that the A theory of time is in fact true, and not the B theory, if we're going to have a successful argument here. So those are the two preliminary notes that I wanted to mention about this argument. But I just want to read out, so what is the premise? Again, this is a logically deductive argument, and the premises are follows. There are 3 premises. So premise number 1, a collection formed by successive addition cannot be actually infinite, or cannot be an actual infinite. Premise number 2, a temporal series of events or past events is a collection formed by successive addition. Premise number 3, and this is the time theory part, the universe's past history of temporal events entails a temporal series of events, i.e. that the A theory or dynamic theory of time is true. Conclusion: therefore, the temporal series of events entailed by the universe's past history cannot be an actual infinite, i.e. it can't be eternal, therefore it must have begun to exist. So that's the argument that we're presenting here with 3 premises. Just note, I've added the third premise. William Lane Craig's version is only 2 premises, and he, in his second premise, a temporal series of events is a collection formed by successive addition, he's kind of assuming that the A theory of time is true as part of the warrant for that premise. I'm separating it out and making my own modification by adding that third premise and just spelling it out for people so they can see that, yes, we're arguing that the A theory of time is true there. So yeah, let's get into that and start assessing the warrant for each of the premises, because again, this premise is logically valid. It commits no formal or informal logical fallacies. Therefore, the conclusion follows inevitably and necessarily from the truth of the 3 premises. So it comes down to, are the 3 premises logically true? Are they sound premises or not? So let's get straight into that. Let's assess the warrant for each of the premises. starting with premise number 1. Now, in the first place, just by way of definition, when we say successive addition in this premise, what we're referring to is basically the accrual of one new element in a set at a later time compared to the previous element in that set, and so on and so forth, out to infinity, presumably. So you can see how this premise presupposes that A theory of time, because for B theory, for people who hold the B theory, there is no one element being accrued one after the other. All the elements just exist tenselessly, all simultaneously. But on the A theory, it's possible to have this thing one after the other in succession. You add more and more grapes to the dish, or you pick one orange and put that in the basket, pick another one, then put that in the basket, one after the other. So yeah, you can see the notion of the A theory of time, or the nature of temporality, is inherently important in the very definition of this successive addition notion that's part of our first premise here. Basically, the problematic nature of forming an actual infinite through successive addition is well known in philosophical circles among philosophers and logicians and mathematicians. It sometimes goes by the name of the impossibility of traversing the infinite. You traverse through, one at a time, an infinite number of things or whatever. And it's almost universally recognized by everyone in this debate that in terms of traversing an infinite by beginning at a certain point, and then proceeding to reach the infinitieth element of a collection. So, for example, say we start at the number 1 and we count up all the way up to infinity, Aleph null number. This is just logically impossible. No one could ever do such a thing, and pretty much everyone agrees with this. You will never be able to reach. You will always only ever be able to reach a finite number with an infinity amount of numbers left to count, an Aleph null number of numbers left to count, no matter how high you go. You will never be able to traverse or convert a potential infinite into an actual infinite. And as I said, this is pretty uncontroversial. Okay, well, if that's the case, well, then how do the atheists and skeptics try to get around this? They must have some trick. They wouldn't just agree with us for no reason, right? You betcha. Here's the trick. Okay, so this problem arises when you begin at a certain point and try to count up. When you're trying to convert a potential into an actual by traversing an infinity, an Aleph null number of elements. But what if there's no beginning point? What if instead of starting at a beginning point and trying to traverse the infinite by counting up, what if there is no beginning point and you count down, but you end at a certain point? So, it's kind of like counting all the negative Aleph null numbers all down to -1. And finally, today you arrive -3, -2, -1. Oh, I made it. Maybe that's possible. The atheists and skeptics will try to argue. But unfortunately for the atheists, really, this notion is just as absurd as counting up to infinity, because at any given point in the series, there's always an actual infinite number of prior events or prior things or prior numbers in the set for you to apparently have traversed. And that's logically impossible for a person to traverse that entire collection to arrive at -3 or -1. If you go to -500, if that's your ending point, there is still an actual infinity of previous numbers up to -infinity that you supposedly would have traversed, and that's logically impossible. And the reason for this is because of things like Zeno's paradoxes. So Zeno was a Greek philosopher, and he came up with certain paradoxes to show that actual infinities are just absurd, yet we have no problem going through them in life all the time. So he had one example that's relevant here called the stadium paradox. So he envisions a sports stadium where, okay, you are here and then you traverse half the field. oh, but before you traveled half the field, you had to have traveled 1/4 of the field. And before you've gotten to the 1/4 mark, you must have passed the 1/8 mark, and so on and so forth out to infinity, so that there are an infinite number of distances before you could have arrived at the halfway mark. And Zeno argues, well, it's impossible. How could anyone ever reach the halfway line of a field? You can't, because there would always be an infinite number of things for you to distances for you to traverse before you could reach that ending point. Therefore, it's logically impossible. However, skeptics will say, yeah, but Zeno's paradoxes are ridiculous, because obviously we do it every day. We see my favorite sports star run to the halfway mark and beyond all the time. So obviously Zeno's paradoxes are ridiculous, and there must be some way out of it, and therefore there's probably a way out of traversing an actual infinite through successive addition in terms of temporal events as well. So basically, arguing like this, the atheist here is mistaken on two grounds. There are fundamental disanalogies, two of them, between Zeno's paradoxes of motion and the notion of traversing an actual infinite past of successive events in order to arrive at an end event, like today. So the first one is, look, Zeno's paradoxes are solved by postulating a mere potential infinity of distances traveled. So the infinite, and this is different, where infinite past time, that actually requires an actual infinite of prior temporal events. So that's a fundamental difference. It basically says, look, the field is conceptually prior to the potentially infinite number of divisions one could draw, with those lines on the field. You could continuously draw things, but that would only be a potential infinite. You would never reach the infinitieth white line on the field. But an eternal, infinite past series of temporal events, like counting down from negative infinity down to -1, that implies an actual infinite being traversed, and that's just not possible. But there's also a second major disanalogy between Zeno's paradoxes of motion and traversing an actual infinite of past time. And that is the fact that Zeno's scenarios only ever envision unequal intervals, right, or division lines. So there's half the field, 1/4 of the field, 1/8 of the field, and combined, all of these only add up to a finite distance. Postulating the infinite temporal regress, on the other hand, no, that's an actual infinity of equal past temporal events, equal temporal durations. 1 hour, 1 hour before that, 1 hour before that, and that sort of thing. And they add up to an actual infinite when you put them all together, whereas Zeno's, it's only a finite distance that when you add the supposed infinity things together, they would add up to. So those are really the Achilles heel of any atheists who try to say escape the Zeno's paradox type objections to this by saying, well, Zeno's paradoxes are obviously solved because we don't have a problem traversing the infinite in those all the time. Well, actually, no, you do, because they're those two fundamental disanalogies, which means you're not traversing an actual infinite in Zeno's stadium example, but you would be in the case of the atheists and skeptics trying to say you can have an infinite temporal past of temporal events, or counting down from negative infinity or something like that. Now, one thing to add here from atheists and skeptics, some atheists and skeptics have tried to appeal to, okay, well, what if we take away one of the disanalogies? Let's pretend that an infinite series of temporal past events, they are not equal, they are unequal or unequal. And they appeal to this thing called a supertask. So supertasks really form a collection that is actually infinite by doing something faster and faster. So imagine like a machine that turns on and off your light switch. Okay, it turns off the light switch after a minute, turns it back on after 30 seconds, turns it back off after 15 seconds, and so on and so forth, out to infinity, increasingly faster and faster, so that it adds up to really a finite amount of time for it to reach the actual infinitieth light switch. But unfortunately, this, again, doesn't work. So, number one, with these types of infinity supertask objects, the problem is, number one, again, you can't traverse an actual infinite. So it's still disanalogous with Zeno, because Zeno only postulates a potential infinite. However, once you reach the hypothetically, let's forget about that for a second. Pretend the machine reaches the omega state. So omega is the symbol for the ordinal number of an actual infinity, as opposed to LF null, which is the cardinal number of an actual infinity. Ordinal just tells you the order of the number, first, second, third, that sort of thing. However, when you reach the state, after you reach, because you're postulating a finite number of actually infinite on and off things, faster and faster, there is a post omega state. It's omega plus 1. However, there's various absurdities, because you could never reach omega plus 1. It's causally, there's a gap. It's causally disconnected from the prior state of omega. Omega plus 1 is completely indeterminate with respect to the omega series. It's like asking, would the light switch be on or off in the omega plus 1 state, that first moment after you reach the actual infinitieth, on or off switch? And the answer is that there isn't any answer given transfinite math, because the state of the lamp at omega plus 1 is completely unconnected to its state during the omega series of the machine flipping that switch on, off, faster and faster and faster. There's this causal gap in reality. So really this proves that supertasks are just metaphysically impossible to exist in reality. They can't exist in reality. We know that all states are causally connected and that sort of thing, in nature at least. And of course, you have to remember, look, when you have an actual infinite number of past events, we're not talking about an actual infinite number of things in a finite amount of time anyways. We're talking about a series where all the intervals are equal. For example, I count negative 50, negative 40. Pretend I count down from negative infinity, and one number every second. There's that equal time interval, rather than going faster and faster. So the issue of supertasks, it's really purely academic. It doesn't apply to the series of past events, which are all equal in duration. So you can't appeal to these to get off the hook. It doesn't avoid the problems. Another major issue that's entirely independent of these Zenonian type paradox considerations, this issues traversing an actual infinite. There's another problem that shows that this is just logically absurd as well. El-Ghazali has mentioned some contradictions that arise. So, for example, let's pretend the planet Saturn orbits the Sun, one orbit around the Sun, but for every time Saturn orbits the Sun once, Jupiter completes 5 orbits around the Sun. Now, basic logic says that the longer they orbit, the further and further Saturn will fall behind Jupiter in terms of its total number of orbits around the Sun. Because, if they continue to orbit forever, then from past eternity, then they basically approach the limit at which Saturn is infinitely far behind Jupiter, actually infinite, LF null, behind Jupiter. Common sense would dictate that Jupiter has completed the greatest number of orbits at any given moment in time after that first interval. However, given transfinite math, the ridiculous and absurd notion comes about that, well, no, technically speaking, mathematically speaking, both planets have completed the exact same number of orbits. And they've completed an infinite number of orbits. LF null is the number assigned to the number of orbits they've both done, even though we know that Jupiter has done an infinite number more than Saturn has done. This just seems incredible. The more the disparity grows between them, yet somehow they just magically become equal in number. yeah, this is obvious insanity, and it could never happen in real life. Any atheists or skeptics who think it can are just, they're not rational agents at that point. Again, another question to illustrate this: how many is the number of orbits that Saturn and Jupiter have done at this actual infinitieth point? Is it even or odd? And mathematically speaking, the answer is it's both. It's both even and are odd. Because in math, look, there's the rule for even numbers equal any cardinal number is even if there is a unique cardinal number, another cardinal number, such that A equals 2 times B. Right? The number equals the 2 times the second cardinal number. And a cardinal number is odd if there is a unique another cardinal number such that the first cardinal number equals 2 times the other cardinal number plus 1. So yeah, and both of these conditions are satisfied. When we're talking transfinite math, both of these conditions are satisfied. So the answer is Saturn and Jupiter are both have both committed an even and an odd number of orbits once we posit an actual infinity number of orbits for both planets. This is just ridiculous, and it's contradictory. So yeah, I don't see how this would work. And there are other examples as well. I'll include some sources for everyone, but there are other analogies or illustrations that represent the absurdity of traversing an actual infinite in this way. One of the most famous is the quote-unquote Grim Reaper paradox, which was advanced recently by Dr. Robert C. Koons and as well Dr. Alexander Pruss. I'll include their sources there. Another good example is Robin Small's Tristram Shandy paradox, where a person writes in their diary every day, 1 day per year type thing, and goes through traversing an infinite and the absurdities that arise in that front. So yeah, just to save time, I won't go into those. Those just back up the illustration of Saturn and Jupiter that I've given in terms of showing how logically absurd it is to postulate an actual infinite being formed through successive addition and trying to traverse an actual infinite to arrive at an ending point. So yeah, check out the sources on my blog site and you can read those for yourself. All right, so let's move on now to the next part. And sorry, I assigned as a worst case scenario too, so that does it for premise number 1, and I've assigned it anywhere between 95 to 100% proven for this premise. And I'm doing that as a worst case scenario. So I'm assigning 95% really to be charitable to the skeptic and atheist. It's not really where I sit. I think, again, this premise is proven true beyond reasonable doubt. But I'm just trying to be generous to the skeptic to help them out here. So we're going to assign a 95% for premise 1. You can assign your own normative probability values, whatever that will be based on the reasons presented and what you think. So yeah, so now let's move on to the next premise, assessing the warrant for premise number 2. And you'll remember premise number 2 states that a temporal series of events is, in fact, a collection that is formed through successive addition. So let's look at how we assess this premise. And basically, it's assuming that the A theory of time is true. There's one temporal event after another in succession. And under that view, this premise is basically true. It's 100% proven true. It's true by definition. It's self-evident. Obviously, 1 hour, then after that another hour, then another hour, or 1 second, then another second, then another second, which is what the A theory presumes as a temporal series of events. Yeah, obviously that is a collection that is formed, through successive addition, one element after another. That's just 100% true. There's not really a lot to say about that premise. I can't see anybody disagreeing with that much. So really, it comes down to our third premise, and this is really where the most controversial part of our argument is going to be, and that is the fact that premise number 3 says the universe's past history entails a quote-unquote temporal series of events, namely that the A theory or dynamic view of time is in fact true as opposed to the B theory of time. And this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time. This is going to be the most controversial premise. The majority of scientists disagree with this. A lot of philosophers of time, brilliant, smart people, hold to a B theory of time. So, this is crucial. We really need to establish the truth of this essential premise and the truth of the A theory of time, that namely there is such a thing as a temporal series of events that are being formed through successive addition. Let's get into that. So in the first place, what I've done is I've assessed various arguments in favor of the A theory of time, as well as against the A theory of time, and I've assessed I've assessed 4 arguments in favor of the A theory of time, and 4 arguments in favor of the B theory of time, because the A theory and B theory are mutually exclusive and exhaustive options. So you have to take one or the other. Either the A theory is true or the B theory is true, and that's sort of a fundamental assumption there. And as we'll see, there are actually at least 2 other options that I'm not including here. So we'll address those when we get there. There's the no time option, which McTaggart opted for, and nobody believes that today. But there are also hybrid views of time, combinations of A and B theories. Michael Tooley, for example, he gets into that. But as we'll see, really the hybrid views of time are really A theories of time. They really believe in temporal succession and temporal becoming, one event after another. So you could really classify it. If the hybrid views of time are true, then that means the A theory of time is really true. Therefore, premise number 3 is true. So it's really the B theory of time that we're going to want to refute here and prove that our A theory of time is in fact true. Now, there are other arguments that I'm not including, just so you know, basically on the A theory of time. For the B theory of time, I've been exhaustive. I've included every argument that I'm aware of, so that was the 4. But there are a total of 6 arguments that I'm aware of in favor of the A theory of time, and I've opted not to include all of them, just to be even. So 4 pro-A theory arguments and 4 pro-B theory arguments. Just so there's parity there and I'm not favoring one side, but be aware that there are additional arguments in favor of the A theory that I'm not covering. So for example, those would be the spatializing time argument. So that this argument looks at the objectivity of temporal relations and that sort of thing, and it's kind of related to relativity theory, which is we're going to be looking at on the B theory side of things. It's one of the main arguments in favor of the B theory side. So I opted to not address this argument in my chapter because it's kind of related to relativity theory, and I didn't want there to be, undue duplication. And so this was one of the ones that I opted to, in trying to make it fair, 4 on each side, I opted to get rid of this one, since we'll be dealing with relativity on the B theory side of things. And the final argument, the 6th argument that I opted to neglect is the biblical argument. So this, obviously I got rid of this because it's not going to be convincing for atheists and skeptics. It's mostly Christian thinkers who are Bible believers and believe in the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, who would be convinced by this. But it's important, just so you know, note that there is an argument from the Bible and the doctrine of creation that allows us to say the A theory of time is true and the B theory of time is false. With that said, let's get into the actual arguments that I do use and I do write about in my chapter here, starting with the 4 arguments in favor of the A theory of time. Okay, so the first thing in favor of the tensed or dynamic or A theory of time is that we have a phenomenological or experiential knowledge via properly basic beliefs that the A theory of time is obviously true. It was none other than the world-renowned philosopher J.J.C. Smart, who was, he's kind of a biased skeptic type, and he was grumbling that, quote-unquote, The A theory of time is so deeply ingrained in every intelligent human being that the view almost seems to be programmed into us by original sin itself. I think that this is a very apt quote because it's, yeah, we know in a properly basic way that, yeah, we experience, grounded in our own experiences of time, that the A theory of time is obviously true. If you're denying it, there's something wrong with you. And typically, even a tenseless theory proponent, a B theorist, Dr. Meller, he's one of the head honchos, one of the world's experts in terms of the philosophy of time. Even he candidly admits, look, quote unquote, tense is so striking an aspect of reality that only the most compelling argument justifies denying it. And this is a B theorist, and a world's expert in the philosophy of time. Principle of enemy attestation, even he's admitting, it would take something extremely compelling to overwhelm our experiential knowledge that the tensed view of time, or the A theory of time, is true. Now, I just want to kind of go beyond this. So properly basically is our subjective evidences, obviously. But in order to coax one out of you, maybe you're wondering, well, what do you mean? It's so obvious that the A theory of time is true. What kind of phenomenological experiences that lead to knowledge by acquaintance or experiential knowledge are you talking about? And really, there are three readily available phenomenological experiences that our properly basic beliefs or knowledge is grounded in. So the first is our experience of the present, the presentness experience. The second are our obvious differential attitudes toward tense. And the third is the temporal becoming experience. So these are the three experiences that we as human beings, every single human being on the planet experiences this every second of every day. And these are the experiences that are grounding this properly basic belief, leading to a warranted true belief that the A theory of time is true. So let's look at the first experience, the presentness experience, or the experience of quote-unquote presentness. As I said, this is something that all human beings universally share. They experience it of every moment of every day, at least when they're consciously focusing on it. On a phenomenological level, we have this inherent awareness or of the present, of what's presently happening around us at this moment, right now. We invent words to represent them. Now, I'm hurt now, or something like that. So this really is powerful evidence that says that A theory's time is correct. There is a now that I'm presently in, and I'm experiencing it at this moment. And really, the only way to get around this is to say, oh, but that experience is illusory. That the typical skeptical escape route, everything is illusory. Everything that's inconvenient seems to be illusory. But when it's convenient, no, well, that's true. When it helps the skeptic's case. I just find that interesting. It's a convenient way to be engaged in special pleading, I find, to dismiss any evidence that is just inconvenient for what the skeptic wants to be true. But some philosophers of time have tried to go beyond just asserting that it's illusory, and they do provide illustration to kind of promote the plausibility of this illusion thesis. So they'll say, well, look, people have been fooled. They see distant starlight that they're actually not really seeing as present, because the star as it appears via the starlight is not present. Scientifically, we've proven that thing is light years behind us. It's billions of years old, or millions, or thousands, however far it is. It takes light a long, long time to reach our eyes on Earth. So therefore, what we're seeing is not really present. It's the past. And they use this as a way to see it's plausible we could be having an illusion. But actually, this counter does not overcome our properly basic beliefs, because we aren't having a properly basic belief that the star is present. But we are having a properly basic belief that the starlight is present to us. The light, as it's appearing to our eyeballs, that is, in fact, present. And that's what the experience that we're grounding our properly basic belief in the A theory of time in. The fact that most people throughout history have derived from that properly basic knowledge that, or experiential knowledge that the A theory of time is true, and then went on to say, well, therefore, not just the starlight is present to my eyes, but the stars themselves, as they appear to me, is present right now, as I see it. Yeah, that's false knowledge scientifically, but that's false knowledge that's derived based on the phenomenological experience of the starlight being present and our properly basic belief that the starlight is present to us. So it's just the atheists are conflating two different things and pretending that we're claiming to have this experiential knowledge of something that no one in the history of mankind would claim was properly basic to them. And in fact, it's derivative knowledge. They're saying the starlight is present to me, I know that in a properly basic way, and from that I derive the conclusion that the star exists as I see it today, in this present moment. Another phenomenological experience is our differential attitudes toward different tenses, toward the past, the present, or the future state of affairs and events. This induces within most humans a knowledge that the A theory must be true, again, in a properly basic way. We recall past events. We feel nostalgia or regret towards past events. We anticipate or we dread future events. It's obvious on a phenomenological level, we feel differently about events solely based on what tense they exhibit. Now, one B theorist has tried to counter this evidence for the obvious truth of the A theory of time. His name is Nathan Oaklander, and he said that really such differential feelings are solely based on the asymmetry of time. So asymmetry of time, that means time's arrow. It runs in the direction of the present into the future, or from the past into the future. And it's this ordering of events into quote-unquote earlier and later than relations that's accounting for these differential attitudes. So once again, it's an illusion. There isn't really a difference ontologically speaking between past, present, and future state of affairs. It's just our feelings are illusory because there's this asymmetry of time that exists, where the direction of time's arrow goes in one direction. But really, this doesn't account for our differing attitudes, because the mere asymmetry of time's arrow isn't sufficient to explain our knowledge of future temporal becoming, and therefore our anticipation or dread, just timeless relations, labeled earlier than and later than. They don't really provide a real basis or true basis for our differential temporal attitudes. It's basically just akin to saying something's to the right or to the left of something else. There's no more meaning to it than that. Because on the B theory of time, all temporal instants have equal ontological parity. And as such, the past, present, and future, they all equally exist at this timeless moment that we all exist in. So there's actually two directions of time. There isn't temporal asymmetry. This is a problem for the B theorists. The fact that we know there is this asymmetry of time is not readily explainable on the B theory of time. There's actually two directions, earlier than, and then there's the direction of later than. And again, on the B theory of time, there's just no accounting for why one feels one way about one temporal coordinate, i.e. the past, versus another, a future temporal coordinate. The two arrows of time could just have easily have been turned 180 degrees. I think even Stephen Hawking has postulated at times about possible worlds or other universes where time's arrow goes in the opposite direction from the future to the past. So obviously, time's asymmetry is not enough to account on a B theory of time for our differing attitude. And then finally, we have our experience of temporal becoming. We see the world in this continuous flux of progressive changes, constant becoming of new states of affairs, and they all seem to flow before our very eyes. They're not disjointed or anything. They're continuous. And this experience is so powerful that really any skeptic who believes in the existence of the external world based on their experiential knowledge of seeing through their eyeballs would likewise have to recognize the validity of our experiential knowledge of temporal progression as well. You just cannot logically affirm one and deny the other. More with this phenomenological experience, this temporal becoming experience, it provides even more warrant, because we then believing in the external world through our senses, because we experience temporal becoming. Forget about the external world. Let's pretend that's an illusion. We're in a virtual world. My mental life, my internal mental life, I experience temporal becoming within my own thoughts. So it's even more firmly established, this notion of temporal becoming. And we just know that things become one after the other. Just think of the NASA space rockets and the countdowns. 3, 2, 1, blast off. Each moment becoming before our very eyes, in this continuous flux of progressive changes leading to that ultimate moment when it blasts off. So yeah, these are the 3 types of phenomenological experiences that human beings have that produce a properly basic belief, and therefore knowledge, that the A theory of time is in fact true. And this is incredibly powerful evidence. I put as a worst case scenario 99%. I'm probably 100% proven on this front, but as a worst case scenario to help the atheist out, I've put this as 99% proven in terms of the phenomenological knowledge argument, constituting evidence that the A theory of time is in fact true. Okay, so let's move on to some of the objective evidences that the A theory of time is true. And the first argument I want to bring here is really a linguistic argument. It's known as the ineliminability of tense argument, and that's in the sense that we can't eliminate tense from our language. We're not able to eliminate that, as though if the B theory of time was true, then yeah, we shouldn't have tense in our language because it doesn't correspond to anything in reality. So this is the first objective argument in favor of the A theory of time. And just to lay out, so it's composed of about 4 premises. So premise number 1, tensed sentences. Tense sentences are things like, yesterday I ran over to the store. Or if you did that today I ran to the store. These are tensed sentences. Or I will run to the store. That's a future tense sentence. So the premise number 1 is we have tensed sentences and they apparently express tensed facts. Premise number 2, the apparent expression of tensed facts by tensed sentences or propositions should be accepted as correct unless either 1, tensed sentences can be shown to be translatable or reducible into tenseless sentences without any loss of propositional content or meaning of those sentences, or 2, if tensed facts can be shown to be unnecessary for the truth of tensed sentences. So those are sort of the 2 escape clauses you can get out of premise 2, which is trying to link tensed sentences mean that there are tensed facts in reality. Tensed sentences correspond to tensed facts. And these are those 2 conditions you can escape that inference in this premise. Okay, so premise number 3, it says, corresponding to the first escape route, but tensed sentences have not been shown to be translatable or reducible into tenseless sentences without loss of meaning or propositional content. Yeah, we'll get into that. And premise number 4 is corresponding to the second escape route in denying that and saying, look, tense facts have not been shown to be unnecessary for the truth of tensed sentences. Conclusion. Therefore, the apparent expression of tensed facts in our language and sentences by tensed propositions and sentences there should be accepted as corresponding to tensed facts, and therefore the A theory of time is correct. So that's the argument in a nutshell there. Now, in terms of assessing, again, it's a logically valid argument. No fallacies are committed by it. So it ultimately comes down to, well, are the premises true? Are they sound or not? Now, in terms of premise 1, premise number 1 is self-evidently true. I mean, it's a very modest premise. It's just saying, we have tensed sentences. I mean, no one denies that. And they apparently express or correspond to tensed facts. It's an apparent expression of the tense facts that we think. That doesn't mean it actually does represent tense facts or not. So I give 100% proven for premise 1. It's just self-evidently true. In terms of premise number 2, once again, this premise is 100% proven true. It's solidly based in fact. It's self-evidently true. Assuming the correspondence theory of truth, whereby there are, I cover that in my show on truth, where we cover, the issue of correspondence theory of truth says that there are truth bearers, so sentences or propositions bear the truth, and then they correspond to a truth maker. So when a truth bearer corresponds to a truth maker, in other words, the truth bearer would be the sentence, the truth maker would be reality. When the sentence corresponds to the fact or reality, then it's true. And basically our linguistic expressions that express tense are generally reliable in corresponding to true facts or truth makers in our mind-independent reality in general. So it's very ad hoc if you want to say, well, actually when it comes to tense, they don't. And there are really these two escape routes that atheists and skeptics or B theorists have tried to come up with to avoid this implication that the truth sentences must correspond to a truth maker, must correspond to tensed facts of some sort rooted in reality itself. Okay, so premise number 3 really denies the truth of the first escape route of the B theorist to try and escape this. Basically saying that tensed sentences can be reducible down to tenseless sentences without any crucial loss of essential meaning or propositional content of the original tensed version of the sentence. And skeptics have kind of retorted by saying, well, we have this thing called the quote-unquote old tenseless theory of language. And this old theory came around in the early 20th century with agnostic philosopher Bertrand Russell. And as you can tell from the name, basically every single philosopher of time subsequent to the early 20th century has abandoned this view. It's obviously false. The old tenseless theory of language is ridiculous and proven to be wrong. But let's just go over it for a moment. So the old people who held to the old tenseless theory of language, they were called detensors. They get rid of tense out of the tensed sentences. So these detensors, like Bertrand Russell, say, look, we can reduce tense sentences to tenseless ones in one of two ways. The first way is to replace tensed expressions with tenseless verbs, along with dates and clock times next to those tenseless verbs. And the second way was to convert tense sentences into tenseless verbs and token reflexive expressions. I'll let you guys read the second way in my chapter. I explain that in detail and go over that, but I just want to concentrate on the first example here for the sake of time in the show, in the podcast part. Basically, what detensors, proponents of the old tenseless theory of language will do and say is, well, look, I can reduce any tensed sentence into a tenseless one with tenseless verbs, and just add in a date or clock time to that to give it a temporal coordinate within a B theory of time, within a tenseless block of time or something like that. And that alone is good enough to, it gives the exact same propositional content as the original tensed sentence. There's no loss of crucial meaning or something like that. However, philosophers of language have really proven that that's complete rubbish, because there is, for a proven fact, absolute certainty, there is a loss of crucial information when you do that. Stanford philosopher John Perry has emphasized the lack of information content that can spur human thought and action that only come about with tensed sentences or expressions and do not result with tenseless expressions. For example, let's say I have a tensed belief, a tenseless belief that my business meeting starts on January 15th at noon in my office building. That's a tenseless statement. That belief might be held by the person all morning. They have that same tenseless propositional content in their head the entire morning. But what accounts for the fact that at noon, the professor then gets up and runs to his meeting because, oh my goodness, I'm late? Well, John Perry argues that what accounts for that fact is that the meeting is starting now. That nowness, that indexical, is essential to the tensed statement and cannot be translated or reduced to the tenseless statement. And that's why the guy, he's spurred to action. He's spurred to get up and say, oh my God, it's now noon. I had better get there. Tenseless counter expressions cannot motivate timely thought or action in the same way that tensed sentences do. There's no, under this old theory of language, or the detensors make their tenseless counterpart sentences, there's no knowledge of what's called, philosophers call de presente, of the present. Only the tensed sentences provide that. The meeting is now. It's noon now. Get up, run. So this has been really destroyed. As I said, all philosophers of time today, no one holds to this or uses this escape route really. So I'm giving a 99% proven for this third premise. As to the token reflexive objection, take a look at go to my blog and read the chapter. You can click on that for free and you can read more details into that. But I think just giving this first way alone is enough to illustrate that, yeah, this escape route doesn't work for the skeptic of the A theory here. Okay, well, what about premise number 4? And this denies the claims of people who hold to the new tenseless theory of language. It denies that tensed sentences, they are irreducible. They can't be reduced to tenseless sentences. They agree with that much. But nevertheless, they say that irreducible tense sentences do not necessarily correspond to tensed facts about reality. Cambridge philosopher David Hugh Mellor, who we mentioned earlier, he admits this himself, but he would take this new tenseless theory of language approach. Okay, so the new tenseless theory, as per Mellor, it basically states, look, the tensed statements are true on the condition that the sentence is uttered or occurs at the same time of the event described. In that case, that's what makes them true, and that's a tenseless fact that it's corresponding to. Likewise, past tense sentences are true if and only if they occur at a later specified time than the event spoken of. So I speak about events timelessly that happened yesterday or something like that. And future tense ones must be uttered at a time earlier than the specified event. So it works by comparing, well, when is the sentence uttered? When does the proposition get uttered? And what is the temporal coordinates, the timeless temporal coordinates of the event spoken of or being uttered about takes place? If I utter a sentence at a later temporal coordinate than the temporal coordinate of the event I'm uttering about, that's a future tense. If I'm uttering about an event that's yet to occur that is at a later temporal coordinate than the uttering temporal coordinate, then I'm speaking about, that's past tense. And if the event that I'm uttering about is taking place at the same temporal coordinate as the coordinate that I'm uttering it, then that's the present tense. So that's how this theory says, well, look, we can have tensed sentences that correspond to tenseless facts, namely based on the temporal coordinate of the object or subject of a sentence or proposition, and the temporal coordinate of the utterance of that sentence or proposition itself. So that's how the new tenseless theory tries to account for this. But this is a total failure, because number one, in the first place, the new tenseless theory of language, it violates fundamental laws of logic. It confuses truth conditions for sentence tokens with sentence types. And I give an example in my write-up there, so I'll let you read that for time's sake. Another major issue that I want to highlight in the podcast here is, look, it makes the absurd claim that some tensed sentences aren't true if they aren't uttered or expressed. So, that means ridiculously, that means to say in the Jurassic era, before any human beings were around to utter sentences and propositions, no one expressed the fact that a given tree existed now, 65 million years ago, at the temporal coordinates of 65 million years ago. So that in fact means that the tree did not in fact exist presently at the temporal coordinates of 65 million years ago. Ridiculous. Pretending that people can apparently recall the existence of something that never really existed presently in the first place. This is just totally absurd, and this is the lengths that B theorists have to go to avoid this argument. I think that says quite a lot. Obviously, the Tarski schema, which says, look, a statement is true if and only if what the statement says, i.e. its propositional content, corresponds to reality, what is actually the case, that correspondence theory of truth. We have a truth bearer, the sentence, and it corresponds to reality, the truth maker. That's what makes it true, and the new tenseless theory of language is just rubbish, in my opinion. So, yeah, that's it for that. That's the ineliminability of tense argument based on this linguistic type argument that we have these tensed sentences in our language, and it must correspond to tensed facts. And if that's the case, then that proves the A theory of time is true. Let's move on to the third pro-A theory, objective evidence. And this is the illusion of becoming, falsifying the illusion of becoming argument. Okay, so with this third argument, it's important to note we're doing a little bit of a switch here. So this isn't so much a direct argument trying to prove that the A theory of time is true. Instead, what we're doing here is we're falsifying that the B theory is true. And if the B theory is false, the only other alternative is the A theory of time. So that's how the argument works. This argument proves the B theory is false, and by logical equivalence, its only other alternative, mutually exclusive alternative, that must mean if the B theory is false, the A theory must be true. So that's what we're doing with the next two arguments. It's kind of a flip. So how does this falsifying the illusion of becoming argument work? Well, there's three premises to it. So premise number one, the temporal becoming of mental events is either a mind-dependent illusion or it is not. Premise number two, if it is not a mind-dependent illusion, then temporal becoming is objective, and hence the B theory of time is false. Premise number three, if it is a mind-dependent illusion, then temporal becoming is objective, and therefore the B theory is false. Conclusion, therefore temporal becoming is objective, and the B theory is false. So let's, once again, this is a logically valid argument. It all comes down to, are the premises sound or not? So premise number one is self-evidently true, 100% proven. It exhausts all the mutually exclusive options, so no one questions premise number one. Premise number two would also seem to be self-evident as well. However, there are some skeptics, I kind of alluded to this, like so basically some skeptics will try to deny the truth of premise number two, which says if temporal becoming of mental events is not a mind-dependent illusion, then temporal becoming is objective. And some skeptics will try to get out of this by saying, well, look, no, temporal becoming is in fact real. It's in the mental realm only, but that does not take place in the external physical world. So that's their sort of escape route to deny this premise. But Unfortunately for them, whether one adopts this kind of hybrid view or not, the fact of the matter remains all temporal theories involving the B theory are totally ridiculous. They lead to this inevitable form of dualism that's really unintelligible, in my opinion. For example, why is it that my mental, quote unquote, now awareness of physical reality itself is uniquely located to one timeless temporal coordinate? If all temporal moments exist ontologically and are on par, why is my mental awareness that does experience this A theory of temporal becoming correspond to a B theory external world? That's kind of problematic. There's simply no reason why our mental conscious now awareness or awareness of the present shouldn't jump all around. Why can't it be at the present now, at one temporal coordinate, and then I might, after 2 minutes, my now awareness might jump to 2 weeks into the past, and then jumps 50 years into the future after 5 minutes, and stuff like that. There's no accounting for this on the B theory of time, as to why this is the case. If you're going to posit that, no, well, our mental lives do experience temporal becoming, but the external world is on the B theory. You can't explain this correlation, this remarkable providential design that would have to be there. Furthermore, another question is, why is it that all human beings seem to be are simultaneously locked into the same now awareness state? Wouldn't we get a mixed bag where my now awareness is at one temporal coordinate and another human being's is at another 50 years in the future, another guy is 20,000 years in the past? Why are all human beings now awareness seem to be tied to this specific temporal coordinate under a B theory of time? That just doesn't make sense either. So yeah, I think premise number 2 is pretty firmly established there. I give it about a 90% proven. But what about the final premise number 3? So this might have been a bit of a shock. So this was saying, well, look, if the temporal becoming of mental events is a mind-dependent illusion, then temporal becoming is objective and the B theory is false. What? Isn't that the exact opposite of what we said in premise 2? Are you speaking out of both sides of your mouth here? How are you getting this? So put it this way, that premise number 3 is true insofar as holding to the view that all of our mental experiences of becoming are illusory, because my now awareness of yesterday and tomorrow are all just as real as my now awareness of the present moment. And that's fundamentally incoherent. The very illusion of temporal becoming logically entails objective becoming. And this is because, look, the illusion of time itself is a temporal flux of experience. And so even if you want to say it's an illusion, the illusion itself is experiencing temporal becoming and temporal flux. My illusion is still proving that the A theory of time is true. It's a changing illusion, so to speak. So this is why premise number 3, even if you want to say that temporal becoming is a mind-dependent illusion, that still proves that the B theory is false and that temporal becoming must be objective, because my illusion itself is experiencing temporal becoming. So that's how that works. And this premise is proven beyond reasonable doubt. I gave it 99.99% proven true. You can assign your own values. But yeah, so that's how this third argument works. And therefore, if the B theory is false, then by definition, its only viable alternative is the A theory, so the A theory must be true. All right, let's turn now to the fourth and final pro-A theory argument. And this is known as the problem of intrinsic change argument. And just like the argument number 3 above, this is not so much an argument directly trying to prove the truth of the A theory, but instead it's falsifying the B theory of time. And by logical equivalence, if the B theory of time is false, the only viable alternative is the A theory, so therefore the A theory of time must be true. So that's how this argument works. It has 2 premises. Premise number 1, if a static B theory of time is true, then the doctrine of pedurantism is true. Premise number 2, the doctrine of pedurantism is not true, Conclusion. Therefore, the static B theory of time is not true. This one's pretty simple and straightforward, but there's a lot that goes into the premises. So let's take a moment to assess. This is obviously a logically valid argument. No fallacies are committed in it. So once again, we need to assess, are the premises both true? Are they sound premises? Okay, so in terms of the argument itself, as I said, there's some background knowledge that you guys need to be aware about. So first of all, this argument hinges on the obvious fact that things in our universe, the various objects, planets, people, animals, rocks, whatever, they undergo intrinsic change over time, just on a phenomenological level, right? People grow up, or biological organisms grow and develop. They change. The geography of the planet Earth evolves over geologic time. Human beings change their personalities, their moral opinions, or their worldviews as they mature. This is an obvious fact that no sane person can deny is true about our world, at least on a phenomenological level. So this obviously means, look, throughout time, it appears that if objects are intrinsically changing, they're bearing different properties at different times. And this creates a bit of a problem. If we want to say, well, is that the same object or not? The logical law of identity, or indiscernibles, says, well, hey, you can't, you have, everything true of A has, if everything true of A is true of B, then they are identical. If something is different, if there's a different property that obtains for object A, then the original object B, then object B and object A are not identical objects. They're two entirely different objects. This contradicts this notion that, no, that's the same rock from moment to moment. Even when I hammer it and slice off a big chunk of that rock, it's exemplifying different properties at that point in time compared to 5 minutes ago before I did that. But it's still the same rock that's endured through time and is now exemplifying different properties, or are they entirely different objects and that sort of thing? Is the substance Dale Glover, when he has his hands, the same person who 5 minutes later had his hand chopped off and he's now a one-handed guy or something? Are we the same object, or are we entirely different objects as per the logical law of identity? So there are two strategies to deal with this. Obviously, we know it's the same object that's enduring on a phenomenological level. So atheists, they don't have a problem here, because they would say there's no violation of the logical law of identity, because only one object ever exists. Only the present exists, so only the objects of the present are existing, and those objects endure through time to each successive temporal moment. As the future becomes present and that sort of thing, the next future moment becomes the present moment, and that all in a line. So things are said to endure through time to later times. And this is a view known as endurantism, and it completely solves the problem. B theorists, on the other hand, are in a bit of a quandary. They don't want to deny that it's a different object, that it's the same object at each temporal location or temporal coordinate. But since all those moments exist simultaneously, they can't deny that there is an object that bears properties A, B, and C at one time, and an object at a later time, T2, that bears properties A, B, and D instead of A, B, C. So under the logical law of identity, they must be different objects, and they don't want to say that because they know that's absurd. So the way that they try to get around this problem is they posit pedurantism. Objects pedure through time. So they basically see, look, we believe in what's called a four-dimensional worm. It's an object. The only objects that exist four-dimensionally throughout all of space and time together. And at any given specific time slice, we're just seeing a part of that four-dimensional worm. So that rock that you're seeing, or that person over there that you're looking at, they're not an object in and of themselves. They're only part, a spatiotemporal part of a larger four-dimensional worm of that object across all of space and time, across all of time. And that four-dimensional, again, on the B theory, that four-dimensional worm exists in its entirety, because timelessly all the moments of time exist. So it's kind of like a loaf of bread, and then you slice up that bread into slices. You have the whole loaf, that's the worm, and each of the slices are spatiotemporal parts of that worm. Four-dimensional worm, so to speak, or super object is another way that people will say. And these four-dimensional super objects or worms overarch or superimpose themselves on the various spatiotemporal parts that make them up. So that's how they try to escape this problem, and as I said, this view is called pedurantism. So having explained that, let's look at the issue of assessing the various premises. So in terms of premise number one, this premise seems rather trivial. One cannot hold to the truth of the B theory of time and endurantism. By definition, they're mutually exclusive, contradictory definitions, right? Because endurantism entails the truth of the A theory of time, that an object exists at any given moment and endures through to the next moment in time, one at a time, one at a time. The B theory says no, they all exist at once, so therefore the objects have to pedure through time. Now, just to be upfront, some skeptics have denied the truth of premise number one, saying that the B theory entails pedurantism, and they've come up with a couple other ways to get out of it, but all of them fail. And check out my book, my write-up, to see the 2 to 3 options that I mentioned there. But just to mention one here, B theorists Mark Heller and Michael Jubian have attempted to avoid this problem of intrinsic change without appeal to pedurantism, by basically just denying that objects exist in the first place. There are no objects. There are no humans, there are no rocks, there are no nothing. There's only this quote-unquote stuff that is spread around in space-time, and that we humans carve up into artificial conventional objects. So this alternative view to pedurantism is called object conventionalism. And it's obviously ridiculous, and it's self-evident this is just completely nuts, and that objects do in fact exist. They're not human conventions whereby we're artificially carving stuff up into objects. No, there are actual objects that exist. It's logically incoherent, to be honest. I mean, conventionalism affirms that conventions used to classify various objects are made by human persons, right? Human minds are the things that are conventionalizing the stuff out there. But at the same time, it also holds that people are merely conventions themselves. It's kind of like the chicken or the egg problem. What came first, the human or the convention? So yeah, this just reduces down to absurdity. Nobody, it's seen as a joke. Even Heller and Jubian themselves admit, they say, look, in terms of object conventionalists, we are quote-unquote embarrassed by the jokes that people, i.e. his fellow academic philosophers, cannot help but making when they are confronted with someone like ourselves who claims that there just simply are no people. Utterly false and ridiculous. Yeah, I agree with that. So sorry, pedurantism is really the only viable option, let's say, that is entailed by postulating the B theory of time. So this premise number one is 100% proven true. If the B theory of time is correct, then pedurantism is true. So really it comes down to the most controversial premise number two, that pedurantism is not true. It's false. And there are a variety of reasons to think that this is the case. So in the first place, pedurantism, the definition of pedurantism is circular. It's viciously circular. Because, look, a peduring object is defined merely as a collection of spatiotemporal parts. But by the same token, a spatiotemporal part is simply defined as a peduring object. And it's viciously circular in this. You don't really ever get a real understanding as to what is meant by these terms. So, yeah, there's that issue in terms of the definitional circularity. But let's get into more substantive objections to this premise. And look, pedurantism really, its account of intrinsic change is very implausible, and it's ad hoc, and therefore it's improbable to be true. Basically, pedurantism denies that any object ever changes. Neither the object as a four-dimensional whole nor any of its associated spatiotemporal parts undergo intrinsic change. And this just violates our obvious experience. Again, our experience is all an illusion, according to these skeptics. It's funny, inconvenient truths can be simply dismissed as an illusion. That seems to be their go-to tactic, but I think everybody who's a rational agent realizes that this is a totally insane notion. Yeah, the main problem with it's just implausible to, there's no way for them to distinguish various four-dimensional worm objects or super objects from other super objects or four-dimensional worms. How do you tell just looking at spatiotemporal parts, you can't distinguish, is my shirt shirt part of my arm or not? Is it part of the same super object or not? Under this four-dimensional worm notion, we just have no way to tell the difference. And this gets into the fact that Prudentists have to hold to this implausible doctrine of arbitrary undetached parts, whereby any material object in any subregion of space constitutes a material object proper, and as such that any object that seems to undergo intrinsic change is not really one object, but would constitute a multitude of objects, plural. To illustrate this, let's take the example of, me, namely me with my appendix at time 1, or T1, spatiotemporal part T1, and then me at a later time, T2, spatiotemporal part 2, T2, without my appendix. In effect, what Prudentists, through this doctrine of arbitrary undetached parts, are believing is that there's actually two objects at the same time there. There's me with my appendix, that's the whole object that manifests itself in space and time, or physically at one time, and there's also this diminished object, me without my appendix, that also exists simultaneously in a diminished way and then becomes whole or manifests itself subsequently at a later time. So basically they have to post this myriad of a whole bunch of pseudo objects to account for all the changes that I go through on a phenomenological level, and say that they all exist in this diminished subregion of space, so to speak. This is entirely ad hoc, and it's very complicated. It's not the simpler notion of just saying, look, there's one single object that only ever exists, and it endures through intrinsic change in time. It's just much simpler. It's much more plausible than positing this nonsense about four-dimensional worms and there being no objects at any given time. Instead, there are only four-dimensional worms or objects, super objects, and also this implied notion that in order to account for, well, how does the intrinsic change take place, there are a myriad of pseudo objects, diminished whole versus diminished objects that exist at any given time. Yeah, I'm sorry, that kind of, it just shows how implausible and ad hoc Prudentism really is. And number 3, another thing is, look, Prudentism contradicts our enduring moral selves, our sense of our enduring selves as moral agents. It makes no sense. I covered this in our Substance Dualism Part 3 series, I think. So it's, we hold people blameworthy or praiseworthy for things that they do at earlier times. And this only makes sense on an enduring or endurantism perspective, because the same object is enduring through time. But under Prudentism, that doesn't make sense. I'm not responsible for what spatiotemporal part Dale number 5 did at time 1. I'm spatiotemporal part Dale number 550. I didn't do that. The other part did that. Punish that part. Don't punish me, because I'm not the same thing as that other thing. And it doesn't make sense to say, oh, well, you're part of the same four-dimensional worm, so that's why we get to punish you. At the end of the day, an entirely different part of me was responsible. I was not responsible for whatever that spatiotemporal part Dale number 5 did back in the good old days, or back in the past. So really, endurantism is the only thing that makes sense of our moral experience of punishing and holding people accountable for their past crimes. Finally, another reason to reject Prudentism is that it implies an implausible view of essential properties. And this was really a great argument advanced by Dr. Peter van Inwagen, and he's essentially destroyed the notion of predurantism with respect to the notion of essential properties. So remember that essential properties are properties that are essential to a kind nature, to a kind of thing. So human beings have certain essential properties or an essential nature. There are also individual essences. So there are properties that are essential to who I am as Dale Glover, an individual substance. But then by contrast, there are accidental properties or contingent properties, things like I have blue eyes or I have white skin or something like that. Basically, Peter van Inwagen, looking at essential properties, he gives the example of, okay, remember Rene Descartes, the famous philosopher who came up with the I think, therefore I am argument. Well, on pedurantism, he was a four-dimensional super object or worm, and he existed at the timeless temporal coordinates of 1596 to 1650 AD. In our actual world, that's when he lived. But yet we can conceive of the possibility, using our modal evaluating faculties, of everything else being equal, except that Descartes died 1 year earlier in 1649, or having lived 1 or even 10 years later, additional years, so that he died in 1651 or 1660 AD. We can conceive of these logical possibilities. So the problem with this for the pedurantist is that, unlike with the endurantists or the atheorists who just think, oh, Rene Descartes was one object living fully at each and every successive time, pedurantists just say, well, he was just a worm that existed exactly these temporal coordinates and his parts made him up. Therefore, all of the spatio-temporal parts they become an essential property of the overall four-dimensional Descartes worm or object, super object there. The super known as Rene Descartes. It's essential that he lives from 1596 to 1650. It could not be otherwise. Otherwise, he's an entirely different four-dimensional worm, because four-dimensional worms are property things. They're mereological aggregates of all their spatio-temporal parts on the view of pedurantism and the B theory of time. Really, we're saying, should it be possible that Descartes either lose or gain any spatio-temporal parts, then logically speaking, through the logical law of identity, we have an entirely different overall four-dimensional object, an entirely different Descartes. And, as I said, it's because pedurantism entails that any four-dimensional object just is the composite of all of its cumulative spatio-temporal parts. Every single part is essential to what or who it is, so to speak. Therefore, if you have any change, that would entail an entirely new, non-identical four-dimensional worm is coming out. But that said, it's obviously logically possible. Rene Descartes is a substance. He's not a property thing. And he is able to exist a different number. It is logically coherent and possible for him to exist 1 year shorter or 1 year longer, 10 years longer. There are possible worlds where Descartes didn't live only until the year 1650, or was born earlier, and that sort of thing. So the length of his life is not essential, and all of Descartes' properties as a spatio-temporal worm are not essential to who he is. He has contingent or accidental properties, including the length of his life. That's a contingent or accidental property of the substance Rene Descartes, and that's the obvious common sense that we know to be true. But pedurantism has to deny that. And so that's how van Inwagen's argument works, and says, well, since pedurantism says what we know to be obviously the case is not the case, therefore pedurantism must be false. And that's how that final argument against pedurantism works in establishing the truth of premise 2 of the final argument for the truth of the A theory of time. Okay, so I think that covers the 4 main arguments in favor of the A theory of time. Let's switch gears now, because atheists and skeptics have come up with 4 main arguments in favor of the B theory, trying to show that the A theory of time isn't true, but actually the B theory or static theory of time is what's true. And as I said, I've organized that into 4 main arguments, and the first one that we're going to be looking at here is the thing that you'll hear from most laymen and lay skeptics or lay atheists. This is really the only one they know or are familiar with in general, and that's the evidence, the scientific evidence from relativity theory, specifically Einstein's special theory of relativity. So I want to turn to taking a look at this argument and see if the special theory of relativity in some way proves that the B theory of time must be true. Okay, so putting it into premise format, atheists and skeptics, or B theorists of time, would phrase it, premise number one, either the Einsteinian relativity interpretation or the Minkowskian space-time interpretation of the special theory of relativity is correct. So that it gives us this dichotomy, either Einstein's interpretation or Minkowski's interpretation of the special theory of relativity is correct. Those are the only two options. Premise number two, if the Minkowskian space-time interpretation of STR is correct, then the B theory of time is true. Premise number three, Einsteinian relativity of STR, or the special theory of relativity, is not correct. Therefore, it follows that the Minkowskian space-time interpretation of STR is correct, and that, as of the conclusion, the static or B theory of time is true. So that's how the argument would work in deductive format on the part of a B theorist, or a skeptic or an atheist who doesn't like the A theory of time and is trying to desperately avoid it. So that's how this argument would work. Again, it's a logically valid argument. No fallacies are committed in it. So really, it boils down to, well, are the premises true or not? Are they sound? Now, in the first place, premise number two is true by definition. It is self-evident, and we know that it's true. So the A theorist can't escape this argument by denying premise number two. It's 100% proven correct. And this is just because once you understand what the Minkowski space-time interpretation is, it's basically, it understands STR in light of a four-dimensional geometrical structure called space-time. And it's this notion that this Minkowski space-time interpretation that all physicists today basically follow and believe in, or most physicists, I should say, sorry. A lot of philosophers believe in this that are B theorists, and it stands behind statements in pop culture, like from Back to the Future 3, where Doc Brown, Marty's like, Doc, I'm going to crash into those Indians if I drive straight at them. And Doc Brown scolds Marty's like, Marty, you're not thinking fourth dimensionally. Well, that doesn't make sense on anything other than the Minkowskian space-time interpretation of STR. So even pop culture has been infected with this understanding or this interpretation. But yeah, basically it says, look, there's this four-dimensional space-time block, 3 spatial dimensions, 1 temporal dimension, and mathematicians like this because they can display it very conveniently with their mathematical equations using non-Euclidean geometry. Yeah, as I said, this premise is unassailable. It's 100% proven true. What about premise number 3 then? Einsteinian relativity is wrong. The interpretation that Einstein himself gave to his own theory is not correct. You might think there's some controversy here, but most scientists and philosophers of time actually agree with this. And so it's currently fairly uncontroversial. In fact, by the time Albert Einstein himself published his general theory of relativity in 1915, so that was 10 years after he published the special theory of relativity, even Einstein himself had abandoned his own interpretation of STR and said it was totally fallacious. He said, quote unquote, "It appears therefore more natural to think of physical reality as a four-dimensional existence, instead of, as hitherto, the evolution of a three-dimensional existence, as per the A theory of time," that Einstein originally postulated in his theory there. So it's important to note that the dichotomy exists. Einstein was originally an A theory held to an A theory of time, even given he was the world's expert in his own theory, STR, special theory of relativity, but he still made that consistent with the A theory of time. But within 3 years, really, within 10 years, of him publishing his own theory, even he himself had said, I was wrong, my interpretation was wrong. and he went with the Minkowskian space-time interpretation of his own theory. So what I think we'll do, we're going to grant premise number 3. There are specific reasons as to why one should think that the Einsteinian interpretation is wrong. I'm not going to get into that because there's no point. It's an uncontroversial point for A theorists and B theorists today. I'm just going to say premise number 3 is 100% proven true to help the skeptic out. So it really boils down to premise number 1. That's the only thing that the A theorist can possibly object to. And essentially the fundamental problem is that, look, premise number 1 presents us with a false dichotomy. It's not the case that you either have the Einsteinian interpretation or the Minkowski interpretation. Those aren't the only games in town. In fact, there's another viable option that, atheists and skeptics or B theorists who are advancing this argument from relativity theory are kind of slyly withholding this third alternative, equally probable interpretation of STR from you. And that's the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation, which does posit an A theory of time, and it is empirically equivalent to the Minkowski space-time interpretation. In fact, I would argue it's a better interpretation, as a matter of fact. But the skeptic, in coming up with this argument, has kind of slyly hidden that from people's attention. Oh, no, let's just not mention it and hope people don't realize. And this, them failing to mention this Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of STR either shows that the atheist and skeptic is either woefully ignorant on the matter or just plain being dishonest in hiding it from people to get, to have their way and to try and prove the B theory. So really, to see why this is the case, so in the first place, we have to understand, well, what is this issue of relativity? What are we talking about here? And we have to understand that the concept of relativity in terms of motion and that existed centuries before Albert Einstein ever showed up on the scene. I mean, Galileo, 400 years ago, had already outlined what some scientists and philosophers call Galilean relativity. And it wasn't long after that the genius Sir Isaac Newton, he described his own notions about the nature of time and space, in which Newton himself differentiated between what he called absolute space and time versus relative space and time. And with respect to time specifically, Newton defined absolute time as, quote-unquote, time that of itself and from its own nature flows equably without relation to anything external, and by another name is called simply duration. Absolute time is just pure duration, and he grounded that in God. Obviously, he was a theist. By contrast, Newton would define relative time as, quote-unquote, some sensible and external, whether accurate or inequable, measure of duration by the means of motion, which is commonly used instead of true time or absolute time, such as an hour, a day, a month, whatever. So relative time only refers to measuring time, measuring absolute time by the means of motion, like a clock or something, or a calendar or something like that. And yeah, we have to so understand there's this difference between the absolute time itself as pure duration, and the measures that we use to measure time through the use of relative motion and that sort of thing. So there's that fundamental distinction here. Keep in mind that's been around, and this prevailed all the way up until the late 19th century. But at that time, a peculiar problem was presenting itself to scientists. So basically, the speed of a wave, a sound wave or a wave in the ocean, a wave through the water or whatever. So depending on whether you're at rest, so your relative motion relative to the wave is at rest, moving toward or away from the wave, and the degree of speed with which you're moving, i.e., so this is your inertial frame, then one will observe the wave either traveling at a slower speed or a faster speed relative to yourself, to your own inertial frame. Light waves, on the other hand, were altogether different, and this is what the problem was that Albert Einstein was trying to tackle, and physicists in the late 19th century didn't understand, because light's velocity had been measured to be the same for all observers regardless of one's inertial frame. So it didn't travel slower or faster relative to one's own motion, or the motion of your instruments that you're using to measure or something like that, it didn't matter. It was always at a constant speed, and this was the quandary that many physicists had to deal with at the time. Well, how do you explain this? Now, a brilliant, world-famous physicist, Henrik A. Lorentz, and some others, kind of capitalized on the differentiation between absolute versus relative time and developed their own relativity theory, where they actually postulated that instead of absolute time being represented by God's time frame, they utilized a concept that was popular at the time and has been since scientifically falsified, the ether time frame. So they just swapped God out for this ether thing. They postulated that light is actually traversing, it may appear that light is traversing identical distances in identical times, regardless of one's inertial frame, but in actuality, it's different. One's motion simply affects our measuring devices that we use to measure these distances and that sort of thing. So our measuring devices themselves, as we approach the speed of light and change our inertial frame, they contract or shrink in the direction of motion. Yeah, the distances actually vary with one's speed, ontologically speaking, but we are simply unable to observe that or measure that variation with our time measuring instruments, because our time measuring instruments themselves are adversely affected. They increasingly slow down when in relative motion as we approach the speed of light, and it makes it appear that we get this quandary that speed of light is just always the same and that sort of thing. So yeah, Albert Einstein then published his special theory of relativity in 1905, and let's just say that Einstein hated Lorentz's idea. He hated this idea of some kind of metaphysical absolute time and space, some privileged inertial frame. He wanted to reject that. And to be honest, it was nothing but pure skeptical bias on the part of Einstein's part that caused him to assert and assume, without any proof whatsoever, that there was this privileged inertial frame, as Lorentz tried to argue. He just assumes no God time, no ether time, all of space and time is relative based on whatever inertial frame one happened to occupy in that given moment. In this case, there's no absolute simultaneity other than one's ability to synchronize their own time measuring devices within an inertial frame. And yeah, the sad fact is that this was just pure assumption. There's no proof, and Einstein, it was just skeptical bias on his part, nothing more, literally nothing more than bias. He was brainwashed by some of the philosophies going around of his day. Things like verificationism, something that's been subsequently falsified and is laughed at by everyone. Even atheists laugh at it today. At least atheists in the know, like philosophers and academics and that sort of thing. But it was this biased verificationism position that has now been falsified and shown to be self-refuting, that Minkowski himself picked up on this and wanted to use for his interpretation and coming up with the space-time interpretation of STR in 1908. So once again, just to recap and summarize the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of STR, it postulates, look, there is absolute space, absolute time, absolute motion, and therefore there is absolute simultaneity that exists, as length contraction and clock retardation are thought to be nothing more than the causal effects of absolute motion on the instruments themselves as you approach the speed of light. Things like coexistence and co-presence are defined in terms of absolute simultaneity of events occurring in the privileged reference frame, the God frame or whatever. Lorentz said the ether frame. Whatever that privileged reference frame is, I would believe that's God. God's time, so to speak, is our time. That's the reference frame. But basically, it's whereby everything is existing at the same time in that frame, and they are all real. This contrasts with Einstein's method for synchronizing clocks, and on the Neo-Lorentzian view, all that amounts to is, look, they will by synchronizing your clocks, you will always inevitably calculate different distant events to be simultaneous with themselves, but That discrepancy lies solely in the fact that the measuring instruments are not measuring reality, but they're being adversely affected by their motion and creating wrong results. So that's how this view explains STR and the relativity data that we have in terms of the measurements and that sort of thing. It does postulate that there is this privileged reference frame, and it's important to note that in terms of the scientific evidence, strictly speaking of the empirical evidence that we have, the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation and the Minkowskian space-time interpretation, so the Neo-Lorentzian being the A theory of time and the Minkowskian representing the B theory of time, are what are called empirical equivalents. They are empirically equivalent. It means you cannot use the empirical data to choose which interpretation is correct for the special theory of relativity. The same empirical observational data are true on both views. So therefore we really have to, if we want to preference one of these interpretations, we really have to rely on outside evidential factors like philosophical reasoning or logical inferences to adjudicate which interpretation should be preferred over the other. And that's what I want to turn to now. I want to see what are some of the reasons to favor a Lorentzian view versus a Minkowski view, or vice versa, a Minkowski view versus a Lorentzian view that people have come up with in terms of going in above and beyond the empirical data itself. And remember, this is an argument for the truth of the B theory, so therefore it is the skeptic of the A theory who bears the burden of proof here. They're making a claim that the B theory is true because relativity theory supports the Minkowskian interpretation. The observational data shows that the Minkowski view is the better interpretation of STR rather than the Neo-Lorentzian one. Prove it, skeptic. Prove it. You can't just assert and assume that. You have to actually do the work of proving that. So remember, it's on the skeptic. I just need to prove that the Neo-Lorentzian view is an equally probable explanation. And in fact, I can do better than that, but that's my minimal goal in this part, is just to say the Neo-Lorentzian view and the Minkowski view are equally possible options, and via the philosophical principle of indifference, we cannot preference one over the other. Therefore, the skeptics has failed, and this relativity argument is a failure. It doesn't prove that the B theory is true because we have the equally probable Neo-Lorentzian interpretation of STR, which allows for the A theory of time to be true. So yeah, with that, let's get into it. So what are some of the reasons to favor the Neo-Lorentzian view over the Minkowski space-time view or interpretation? Well, in the first place, the Lorentzian view can be argued to be superior to the Minkowskian view. It has better plausibility as well as a superior explanatory power and scope compared to the Minkowski space-time interpretation. Why? Well, because the coexistence relation is basically a natural fit on the Lorentzian view. Again, remember, absolute simultaneous events are simply a unique class of events that are co-present and coexistent at any given time within the privileged reference frame, inertial frame or whatever, for absolute time and absolute space and absolute motion. By contrast, the coexistence under the Minkowski space-time view, it's extremely implausible. It requires us to say that two events which cannot be connected by a light signal are coexistent for some observer, even if, relative to that observer, one event is in the future and the other is in the past. It's important to note, we're not just simply talking about coexistence in a tenseless sense, whereby all light signal connected events exist as part of this four-dimensional space-time block. Instead, what this view is saying is that the implausibility of this view comes from the fact that it's looking at there's a special class of events standing in a specific relation to each other known as the coexistence relation, despite one being in the future and the other in the past. That is absolutely absurd, and it's totally implausible. But yet, that's what the Minkowski space-time interpretation of STR entails, that you would have to believe that that is the case. Okay, another reason to favor the Lorentzian view over the Minkowski view. The Neo-Lorentzian interpretation says that things do not come to exist or cease to exist as one changes inertial reference frames. Remember, they're all existing within this one privileged frame of absolute time and absolute space and all of that, namely God's time. And in Minkowski's view, on the other hand, it really denies that things ever come into or ever go out of existence altogether. Intrinsic change is claimed to be an illusion, something that we've argued for above. It is a very weak notion. It entails pedantism and that stuff as opposed to endurantism. So Minkowski's space-time view really lacks explanatory power in explaining these phenomena and addressing some of the arguments that I mentioned above. And finally, the Lorentzian view, it merely states that our measuring devices, like our clocks, are retarded, and that length contraction takes place depending on one's inertial frame, relative inertial frame, as one approaches the speed of light. So, that is far, far less implausible and a lot less ad hoc than suggesting that there is no, in fact, any 3D objects that exist. But instead there are these four-dimensional worms, this made-up concept that there's no proof for and just asserted and assumed to be the case by skeptics and atheists. So yeah, the Lorentzian view compared to the Minkowski view is very ad hoc in this way. It posits four-dimensional worm super objects and says that there really are no three-dimensional objects that exist at a given time. We're just spatiotemporal parts or slices. I don't buy it. I don't have that much faith, to be honest. I don't know how the atheists can muster that much faith to believe in something like that. But they do. So fair enough. So yeah, that's really the main reasons why one should prefer a Lorentzian view to a Minkowski. But atheists and skeptics, or B theorists, they present their own reasons as to why one should favor the Minkowski view over and against the neo-Lorentzian view. And they have, I think, about three, maybe four. I think I presented three. So the first one is, okay, well, contrary to what we just said, that the Lorentzian view is less ad hoc, or it's simpler than the Minkowski view, well, tables have turned. The Minkowskians say, the B theorists say, no, Minkowski's view is simpler. It's the simplest explanation. It doesn't postulate, notions about the clocks being retarded and length contraction and all of this stuff. It's claimed that it's comparatively simpler than the neo-Lorentzian relativity interpretation. Thus, as per Occam's razor, one ought to favor the Minkowski's view over and against the Lorentzian view. So just by way of retort, in the first place, this is a very naive use of simplicity as some kind of equation for truth. And it comes at the cost of preferencing simplicity at the expense of things like having a higher explanatory power, a higher explanatory scope, or higher plausibility. Remember, these inference criteria, we have to weigh them, assign them weights and significances in terms of their priority. And having a higher explanatory power, scope, and plausibility should be preference to something that's just a simpler or less ad hoc explanation. So even if we grant them this, it still doesn't overwhelm the fact that the neo-Lorentzian view is a greater explanatory power, scope, and plausibility, and should therefore be preferred. However, we don't even need to go there, because it's just demonstrably proven that the Minkowski view is not simpler or less complicated than the neo-Lorentzian interpretation. This is just false. And essentially, originally, Lorentz's interpretation, the original interpretation from the 19th century given by Henrik Lorentz himself, was more complicated than Albert Einstein or Minkowski's view. But subsequent to that, in the 20th century, H.E. Ives was able to derive the Lorentzian equations. This is why we're new Lorentzian interpretation. And he was able to derive the Lorentzian equations, which obviously served as the fundamental mathematical core of Einstein's STR, basically copying off Lorentz to get those. But he derived these Lorentzian equations directly from the laws of conservation of energy and momentum, and also from the laws governing the transmission of radiant energy. And once that happened, as Martin Rudifer observed, Ives' updated calculations made the exact same and possibly even less made the exact same number and possibly even less basic assumptions than Einstein or Minkowski's interpretations. So it may even be proven to be simpler than these on their own assumptions. It takes less basic assumptions, or at the very least, it's been proven to have the exact same number of basic assumptions that Minkowski's interpretation does. So you can no longer claim that Minkowski's view has a comparable simplistic elegance or beauty compared to the Lorentzian view, because under the Neo-Lorentzian view, thanks to the works of Dr. Ives, it's been proven that they're exactly on par. If not, the Neo-Lorentzian view is even simpler. It employs less fundamental assumptions in it, or unproven assumptions in it. Yeah, I think this is a failure on the part of skeptics and atheists, or the B theorists there. But they're not done. They have another attempt here, another argument that they say, and this is called the deceptive concealment of nature argument. And Minkowskians will try to say, well, look, one ought to prefer the space-time relativity interpretation over the Neo-Lorentzian relativity interpretation of STR, because Neo-Lorentzian relativity entails the existence of a fundamental asymmetry that, whereby nature itself almost conspires to conceal from us. As we approach the speed of light, our clocks and all of our measurements of time and that sort of thing and distance contract, they shrink, so that we're tricked into thinking that the speed of light is constant in every inertial frame, and all of this, all of the relativity interpretations that we get from that. It seems like nature's quite the trickster. It's trying to trick us. No, it's better to prefer the Minkowski view and just say, no, nature is what it seems like it's going to be here. So by way of response, Neo-Lorentzians have, number one, in the first place, they've questioned this seeming presupposition of the skeptics that if fundamental asymmetries exist, then nature must readily express them candidly and openly to us. Who said that's the truth? I mean, many times nature has, quote-unquote, conspired to hide things from plain view. Who would have ever predicted quantum physics or quantum phenomena, for example? So it doesn't do to just give this simplistic assessment of, well, Mother Nature can't be smart and won't conceal things from us. No, truth is sometimes stranger than fiction, and that's been scientifically proven to be the case. So you can't really rely on this flawed reasoning to prefer Minkowski's view. But what's even worse, look, Minkowski's view would also entail an equal, if not more, amount of concealment of fundamental reality from us, because, look, it implies that all of our observational and experiential knowledge of space and time is an illusion. Remember how many times we mentioned that the skeptic has to dismiss data as an illusion when we were going over those A theory arguments in favor of the A theory of time. Just philosopher of science Tim Maudlin even said, he's argued that the Lorentzian solution cannot be rejected on the grounds that it would be deceptive of nature, for this invented problem applies in one way or another to all the various interpretations of STR. So if you want to argue that way, well then great, we can rule out Minkowski's view, because that view is even more deceptive than the Neo-Lorentzian one. But yeah, I don't think that this factor really allows us to privilege one theory over another. Now, in the second place, what's even worse for these people making this concealment argument is that it's just not true. Nature doesn't, in fact, conceal the truth about these fundamental asymmetries entailed by the special theory of relativity. Don't forget, so in the first place, STR is an extremely limited and restricted theory. In terms of its application to reality, it only applies to uniform motion. But when it comes to acceleration, like accelerated motion, or rotating motion, for example, these are in fact absolute motions which nature does nothing to conceal from us. That there is this absolute motion, absolute time, and all this. So yeah, it's just not true. We can still be able to realize that there are things like absolute time, space, absolute simultaneity, absolute motion by studying other forms of motion outside of the uniform motion that STR applies to, and which it doesn't apply to the other forms of motion. So we can if nature is hiding it in terms of uniform motion, it's revealing the truth in other forms of motion, so we can discover the truth that way. And additionally, recent scientific experiments using Bell's theorem have actually shown that it's very plausible to require a notion of absolute simultaneity and absolute motion, and thereby reinvent the need for a privileged inertial reference frame, contrary to what the B theorists pretend STR entails. The recent scientific experiments using Bell's theorem have actually disproven the Minkowski view and made it much more likely that an A theory of time, as per the Neo-Lorentzians, is probably true. Now, the B theorist, in terms of the relativity argument, has one last stratagem that they'll try to smuggle in a B theory here this way. And they'll say it's the general theory of relativity, GTR. This is the factor that space-time realists, they'll often point to that, and they'll say, well, look, it posits that gravity is not so much a force, but it's merely the curvature of space and time. So think of space and time as kind of like a sheet, and then you put a bowling ball in the sheet, and then it creates that indentation. So it warps and bends space-time itself and causes that depression, so that anything that gets close enough to it, rolled by it, will get sucked into that indentation and go around and get sucked into the massive object, the bowling ball itself. And we'll say, well, surely this allows us to say that the Minkowski space-time view is correct, doesn't it? Well, unfortunately, no, it doesn't, because most physicists would agree with me and not with the latest skeptic on this front that GTR is really just a helpful heuristic, or it's a model, it's an instrumental tool that helps us to understand the universe geometrically. But that has nothing to do with the nature of reality itself. It's just totally irrelevant to the ontological status of the universe and the way it works. And as I said, the vast majority of qualified physicists today agree with me on this, that the theory should only be used in a mere instrumental way. If you don't believe me, let me quote some famous atheists and skeptics here. So, famous philosopher of science Arthur Fine, he claims that few, if any, working knowledgeable scientists today see the general theory of relativity as anything more than a quote-unquote magnificent organizing tool for dealing with gravitational problems, rather than expressing some kind of big truth. French physicist Henri Anzalès, he states, quote-unquote, the four-dimensional continuum, or the space-time continuum, should therefore be regarded as nothing more than a tool and not as physical reality. World-renowned expert Max Black is entirely forthright in saying, quote-unquote, the picture of a block universe composed of a timeless web of world lines in a four-dimensional space is a piece of gratuitous metaphysics, a useful limitation in the form of representation, often mistaken by laymen for an ontological deficiency in the universe itself. This is just devastating to the Minkowskian person who wants to argue that GTR proves that the Lorentzian view is improbable relative to the space-time interpretation of STR. But it gets even worse for the space-time realist, for the Minkowskian here, because the Minkowskian interpretation actually hinders the progress of scientific investigation itself. It obscures our understanding of nature, because what happens is it serves to impede progress in connecting the theory of gravity to the theory of particles, as even the atheist Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg, someone who I'm sure you guys are familiar, a lot of the atheists and skeptics would probably look up to in this audience, but even he himself is intellectually honest enough to admit that taking gravity as a quote-unquote real force is just ridiculous, and it impedes a crucial link between GTR and particle physics, as there must be a particle of gravitational radiation, namely the graviton, end quote. So the search for a unified theory of the forces of nature and the discovery of gravitational waves pretty much ensure the necessity of these graviton entities, despite there not being any confirmed observations of them at this time. Yeah, this is a huge problem. Once again, just to quote that our atheist Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg, our good buddy in this case, he says about geometrical four-dimensional space-time, quote-unquote, geometrical four-dimensional space-time, as per GTR and STR, must out of physical necessity be regarded as nothing more than a mathematical tool, not as a fundamental basis for the theory of gravitation. My goodness, you've just been destroyed by your own kind. And he says it's out of physical necessity, so it's impossible, physically speaking, for it to be anything other than just a mere mathematical tool. So yeah, it's obvious you cannot use GTR as a way to privilege the Minkowski interpretation of STR as opposed to the Neo-Lorentzian interpretation. I think that kind of conclusively refutes the B theorist using relativity theory to argue that the B theory of time is true. So yeah, let's move on to the second evidence or argument that B theorists give to try and prove the truth of the B theory of time, or the static theory of time. And this is kind of a counter mirror argument to one of the four arguments I presented above about the issue of temporal becoming. And this argument is about the mind dependence of becoming argument. So this is by an atheist philosopher, Adolf Grönbaum. He's basically argued that, look, we can demonstrate that temporal becoming or temporal succession requires, out of necessity, requires a subjective, conceptualized awareness of being experienced now. They're inevitably linked in that way, and as such, he argues that since this feature is inherently mind dependent, it is not an inherent attribute of the physical events itself, of the external reality. And Grönbaum basically presents three separate arguments in reinforcing this overall argument. So the first one, mind dependence arguments number one, is the triviality of objective nowness. So take the proposition, it is now 3 p.m. This is a proposition clearly conveying information, but Grönbaum says that the word now does not refer to the content of some kind of subjective awareness. If it doesn't refer to this subjective awareness, then it seems the only thing that it can refer to objectively is the temporal location, or the timeless temporal coordinates designated as 3 p.m. So it's kind of like saying it just reduces an objective. If we treat the now part as objective, then it becomes a triviality. It's like saying it is 3 p.m. at 3 p.m. And he presents his argument in premise format as such. So premise one, it is now 3 p.m. is an informative statement. Premise number two, if presentness is not mind dependent, then it is now 3 p.m. is not an informative statement. Conclusion, therefore, presentness is mind dependent and is therefore not an objective feature of reality. All right, so how might we go about tackling this first argument from Grönbaum? Well, in the first place, the first premise is logically sound and it's uncontroversial on all sides. So it comes down to the second premise. And in order to defeat this premise, all we have to do is to show that the proposition, it is now 3 p.m., is in fact informative despite the fact that it's mind independent. So that mind dependence is not a required thing for this to have meaning. Remember one of our arguments up above for the A theory, where we talked about the essential indexical, right? And that proves that such statements do indeed convey information that their tenseless counterparts do not, or cannot, even in principle, express. Now, according to Grönbaum, all this statement about 3 p.m. being now really conveys is that it is 3 p.m. simultaneous with a certain subjective, conceptualized awareness of events going on at the temporal coordinates 3 p.m. But if you remember, I argued above, John Perry's argument is really irrefutable based on this essential indexical, and it shows that this tenseless truth proposition just fails to inform me about when it is actually now. When the clock hits 3 p.m., I get up and say, I'm late for my meeting. I've got to get to my meeting now. We have this awareness that it is 3 p.m. and tenseless facts that we're at the timeless temporal coordinate of 3 p.m. just cannot do that, cannot provide that, because all the moments exist equally and that sort of thing. So essentially, the tenseless construal of it is now 3 p.m., that proposition lacks crucial information, and that's why this argument just fails on the part of Grönbaum. his Grunbaum's second argument for the mind dependence of temporal becoming is, look, he argues there's an absence of temporal becoming from physical time. And I think this is Grunbaum's strongest argument personally. But he basically says, look, our physical theories and physical textbooks know nothing of temporal becoming. But if temporal becoming was an objective feature of the world, well then surely the physical theories couldn't just ignore them. They would have to mention them, otherwise they wouldn't have the explanatory success that they do. So in deductive format, it would be premise number 1, current theories of physics take no cognizance of temporal becoming. Premise number 2, if temporal becoming is an objective feature of the universe and current theories of physics are explanatorily successful, then they must be cognizant of temporal becoming. Finally, premise 3, current theories of physics are explanatorily successful. From that, he gets his conclusion, therefore, temporal becoming is not an objective feature of the universe. It's instead a subjective, mind-dependent phenomenon. So how might we assess this second argument from Grunbaum for the mind dependence of temporal becoming? Well, in the first place, premise number 3 is uncontroversial and regarded by true by everybody, but premise number 1 and 2 are demonstrably false. So with regard to premise 1, the notion that modern physics makes no reference to temporal becoming is just laughable. I mean, it plays a vital role in all of science. I mean, meteorology, geology, forecasting the weather, determining when a volcanic eruption will take place. All of these show that temporal becoming is ontologically real, and they're a part of the physical theories themselves. However, Grunbaum and other B theorists might try to slyly retort to this and say, yeah, but those are examples of applied sciences. I'm talking about real physics, theories in the hard science of physics itself. They don't reference temporal becoming, and this is just, again, wrong. Actually, it mentions them all the time. It mentions temporal becoming. It's deeply ingrained into the field of modern physics. You know, for example, Hugh Price rants and raves about how modern physics is in need of a wholesale reform to rid itself of the obvious references to tense and temporal becoming. He says, quote unquote, the ordinary temporal perspective is so familiar and so deeply embedded in physical sciences that we need to be suspicious of almost every concept in contemporary physics. Wow, that's just truly incredible. And you know, it kind of makes you laugh a bit, because who is supposed to be the science deniers again? The atheists or the Christians? Pretty sure it's the atheists, if that's the case. But it's even this hardcore B theorist, Price, is admitting it's just interwoven and ingrained in hardcore physics. I mean, we have concepts like degrees of freedom, potential, dispositions, causal dispositions of a given object or something like that. These all imply future tense and temporal becoming. You know, it has the disposition to become. Caterpillar has the disposition to become a butterfly. It hasn't, but that's just potential. It hasn't actualized that state of affairs yet. But eventually in the future, it will become that. This temporal becoming will take place. So yeah, it's just not true. It's embedded in physics in the first place. But what about the second premise? Well, this basically tries to say that if physical theories are to be successful, and temporal becoming is an objective, mind-independent, not dependent feature of reality, then physical theories must mention them in order to be successful. But this is just not true. First of all, physics is context-independent and underdeterminative in a lot of ways. So, for example, Max Black mentions that no one needs to know who the scientist was who observed this or that result in order to understand Boyle's law, or any other repeatable scientific statement for that example, for that thing. You know, this universalizing feature of scientific theories via their abstraction from indexicals like the here and now, that doesn't undermine their explanatory adequacy or sufficiency. So it's just not true that scientific theories have to be all encompassing of reality. In fact, it's often they're very restricted and limited. You know, so this tendency to detense universal scientific theories really only serves to help distinguish between time itself and from our empirical measures thereof. Remember, going back to the relativity theory, that There's the difference between how we measure time and absolute time itself. Now, time in physics is merely a diminished abstraction from a far richer and grander metaphysical reality, and that's fine. You're allowed to do that. It works, and these reduced features work for the purposes that they are there for. But by the same token, we recognize that they're incomplete. They are not insufficient. They don't adequately represent all of reality, and this is especially the case in terms of time itself. We know that absolute time is a far richer and grander metaphysical reality than in any of these physical scientific theories that come up with physical time. Those are just wholly inadequate. And Mary Clue, a philosopher, has really come up with the best. She was sort of quoting this and saying, look, the time of physics is improperly called time. It is nothing more than an artificial abstraction from lived absolute time. Past, present, and future have gone, and in their stead remains only the logical relation of before and after, or earlier than and later than, expressed in terms of numbers. This is wholly inadequate to define what we mean by time. And some people have come up, one expert, Carlo Rovelli, has done a great work here, and I'm going to include a table that he's done here because I think he distinguishes between time proper, absolute time, and our measures of time, or physical time as represented in the books of physics. And we have multiple notions of time in terms of science and physics and that sort of thing. But he goes, okay, so in terms of time proper, absolute time, there are at least 8 properties, aspects, or features that we know about. So number 1, time is one-dimensional. It can be divided up into a collection of instants or intervals, that can be arranged on a one-dimensional line. Time is metric, so time intervals can be measured so that any 2 or more intervals can be said to have an equal duration. 3, time is temporally global. So, the real variable represented by t, quote unquote t, used to denote the measure of time, goes through every real value from negative infinity to positive infinity, potentially. 4, it's spatially global, which means that the time variable t can be uniquely defined at all spatial locations and points. 5, external, so the flow of time is independent of the specific dynamics of any and all objects moving within time. 6, it's unique. Time is unique. There are not many times, but just the time. 7, time is directional. So we mentioned before the asymmetry of time. Time's arrow. It's possible to distinguish the past from the future direction of the timeline. And finally, 8, time is present. So there always exists a preferred instant and or interval of time, the quote-unquote now. So these are the 8 features that we know about time proper, about absolute time, that we experience it, as pure duration today. And there's been a helpful chart by Rovelli here in terms of the various time proper compared to the various notions of time as explained in the physics textbooks, and how they relate and fulfill these 8 criteria for giving us an adequate definition of time. So in the first place, time proper, well, that has all 8 of these features. It's the best. Then the next in line is the notion of time as given in the laws of thermodynamics. And that basically it has all of the properties except for the last one. It doesn't have this ontological presentness or this now within time, but it has the other 7 features I mentioned. After that, then we have Newtonian physics notion of time. Newtonian physics notion of time gives us everything except the last 2 features of time, so up to feature 6. Then we have the special theory of relativity, or STR, by Albert Einstein. That only has the properties up to 5. So it's missing 3 fundamental features of time proper. So it's an even more diminished concept, but it's still a successful theory. It works, but we know that it's not adequate to explain all of reality in terms of what time is. We have cosmology, or cosmological models of time. These have all the properties up to 4, and so it's missing 4 of those features of time proper. Then there's the general theory of relativity, or GTR. This is GTR, known as GT, quote unquote GTR proper time. So this only has features, only has 1, 2, 3, and 5. It's missing, again, 4 features. There's GTR coordinate time. This only has 3 features. It has properties 1, 3, and 4. Then there's GTR clock times. Well, these only have 2 properties. They have properties 1 and 2. And then finally, there's quantum gravity. And this has no temporal properties. That is none of those features that we know represent reality in terms of absolute time and time proper as expressed in the universe. So all of these physical theories or notions of time, they're successful. They work. They operate successfully in science, but they leave off one or more of the various known features of time proper, thereby being inadequate to fully describe nature. But yet they work. So this proves that it's not necessary. A scientific theory doesn't have to mention temporal becoming if it's a real feature of the universe or of the reality. It's a mind-independent feature as opposed to a mind-dependent one. So this premise is obviously false. And I thought that chart was a great way of illustrating that. So I'm going to try to include that in the video for you guys to check out. Okay, finally, mind dependence argument number 3 from Gronbaum. Okay, so this is what Gronbaum calls the why is it now argument, and this is the weakest and most ridiculous argument that he gives in my estimation. But yeah, he basically says, look, premise number 1, if nowness is an objective feature of events, then there must be distinct explanations for why an event occurs in 2020 and why events of the year 2020 have nowness in that same year. Premise number 2, there cannot be distinct explanations for these facts. Conclusion, therefore, nowness is not an objective feature of events and is instead mind-dependent. So, yeah, this argument really is just utter nonsense on the part of the atheist and skeptic, or the B theorist here on Gronbaum's part. Premise number 1 is just sheer skeptical nonsense and should be simply dismissed as such. There's literally no difference in terms of asking for an explanation as to why an event becomes temporally present in 2020 versus why the event tenselessly occurs in the year 2020. You know, if the causal history leading up to an event suffices to explain why an event occurs in 2020 on the B theory of time, then that same causal history explains why it becomes present in the year 2020 on the A theory of time. What's worse, on the tensed theory of time, it is simply not possible for an event to have presentness at any other time other than the time at which it occurs. So it's just a tautology to say that any event occurring at clock time t has the attribute of nowness at time t. I just really... I don't know what he was thinking with this argument. It's just not a good argument at all. But yeah, I wanted to present that for you guys to consider and read that in my notes. So yeah, let's move on to the third argument for the B theory, and that is the argument from McTaggart's paradox. Now, just note, so same deal as we did with the 4 A3 arguments above. After the first 2, we kind of flipped it. This is going to be the first start of a flipped argument. So it's not necessarily going to be arguing that the B theory directly, that the B theory of time is true. It's instead going to be arguing indirectly that, number 1, the A theory is false, and therefore the only viable alternative to the A theory is the B theory. So therefore the B theory must be true. So yeah, that's what this argument, that's how it operates. So let's get into it. What is this McTaggart's paradox? Okay, so John Ellis McTaggart is probably one of the most famous and influential philosophers of time to ever exist. It was actually him who in 1908 who first invented the terminology A theory versus B theory of time and made that differentiation. So he's come to define the field since the early 20th century, and basically all subsequent writings adopt his work and take one of the 2 strategies. Now, with McTaggart's paradox, so back in 1908, McTaggart is an interesting person. So remember I said there are only 2 options. There's the A theory or the B theory. And there's also some people who take a hybrid, like Michael Tooley, for example, they'll take a hybrid A-B approach. They kind of see time as like a block of time, but the block of time keeps expanding. So that's the A theory part. But McTaggart is interesting because he actually takes another option. So what he does in his work, it's a two-pronged approach. So in the first place, he completely destroys anyone who believes in the B theory of time. He creates devastating arguments against the B theory or static theory of time and says why that's impossible to be true. And, obviously many A theorists like myself, they love him for that. And they say, hey, he's a great guy. So we take the first half of his book and we say that's what we like to hear. But in the second half of his book, he goes after the A theory and tries to destroy them and says that's logically incoherent too. So therefore, he comes to the radical conclusion, look, there is no time at all. Time is just an illusion. It doesn't exist. A theory or B theory, there is no time. He takes that third alternative. And he's really the only one who really ever takes that view. And it's been subsequently refuted. It's obvious there is time. It's just a question about the nature of time. As we all experience, there is this temporal dimension. Subsequent to McTaggart, everyone has refuted his notion that there is no time. That's not a valid option. And it's the field has really coalesced subsequent to McTaggart to, okay, well, is it the A theory or the B theory? But McTaggart's an interesting person. He took a third alternative, and his arguments do define the field. He was the one who first distinguished between these two types or theories of time. So for our purposes here in this argument, we're going to ignore his arguments against the B theory because we're trying to support the B theory here with these arguments. These are pro-B theory arguments. So in that sense, we're going to look at what is this paradox that he lays out that refutes or shows that the A theory is logically contradictory or ends in paradox. Well, to put it in premise format, essentially it would go like this. Premise number one, if a tensed theory of time is correct, events are past, present, and future. Premise number two, events cannot be past, present, and future unless either one, events are past, present, and future only in relation to other events. So that would be the B theory of time. Or two, events are past, present, and future in a hypertime dimension. So those are the two options that McTaggart sees to say that events are in fact ontologically past, present, and future as per the A theory. Premise number three, if a tensed view of time is right, then events cannot be past, present, and future only in relation to other events. That premise is just obvious. I mean, that entails the B theory. So the tensed theory cannot be true if the tenseless theory of time is true. Premise number four, if a tense theory of time is right, then events cannot be past, present, and future in a hypertime dimension. So therefore, he gives a series of conclusions. Sub-conclusion one, therefore, if the tense theory is true, events cannot be past, present, and future. Sub-conclusion number two, but if the tense theory is true, events both are past, present, and future by definition, and events simultaneously are not past, present, and future through the deriving the premises. So therefore, final conclusion, the tense theory of time is not correct. It violates the logical law of non-contradiction because it says if the tense theory of time is true, then events are both past, present, and future, and they are not past, present, and future at the same time. So that's McTaggart's paradox in premise format there. Once again, this is a logically valid argument, and it commits no fallacies or anything like that. So it comes down to, well, are the premises true or not? So let's look at that. Now, in terms of assessing the premises, so as I said, premise number three is true by definition. It is just self-evidently true. Premise number four is also 100% proven true in our estimation, and it's relatively uncontroversial among even the A theorists agree with this, because McTaggart has effectively demonstrated that, look, the same contradiction will always result at any and all hypertime levels. So you can kick the can down a level by saying, well, there's a hypertime dimension, so events are past, present, and future in light of hypertime or something like that. And Oh, if that, but then the contradiction arises. Okay, well, we have a hyper time dimension, and you can do that out to infinity, but that just creates a vicious infinite regress. And the infinite regress here is vicious because basically at every single level, at every hyper time dimension, the fundamental problem of the paradox remains completely unsolved. So premise number 4 is true. The hyper time route is not going to get you off the hook. Now, what about premise number 1 then? Some atheists do object to this. They say, well, look, it just amounts to question begging because it's merely asserting that events are tenselessly past, present, and future, and rather it should say that events are present, were future, and will be past. So remember, we don't view events, all events having ontological parity in terms of past, present, future. There's only one event, the present. And they'll object and say, well, premise number 1 is kind of question begging. It's assuming that there are past, present, and future events that all exist simultaneously, and that's just the B theory. That's a tenseless understanding. But I think that this issue is really speaking at an objection to the truth of premise number 2. So I'm going to grant premise number 1, at least the way that we've phrased it, because I think it can be tweaked and kind of overcome this objection, but the main objection still holds, but applies really to premise number 2. That's really the fly in the ointment of this argument, so to speak. So basically, to understand why we would object to premise number 2, again, it's presenting us with a false dilemma, saying that events cannot be past, present, and future, ontologically speaking, unless one of 2 conditions applies. Either the B theory is true, obviously we proved in premise 3 that B theory is false, or number 2, that events are past, present, and future in a hypertime, and we know that that doesn't work through premise 4, that can't result. But there's another option. They're presenting us with only a false set of options. They're leaving out a third alternative, and that's really the problem here, because what in refuting the A theory and coming up with this McTaggart's paradox argument, McTaggart is really envisioning a sort of hybrid A-B theory. He's not refuting the A theory proper, but a hybrid A-B theory, where he views all the past, present, and future events. They all exist simultaneously, just like on the B theory. They have this ontological parity in this sort of a space-time continuum, but that there's ontological present. So the present moment is an ontological feature of reality. It's kind of an illustration to define this would be, picture a string of light bulbs, and the present light bulb is lit up blue, the future light bulbs are lit up red, and the past light bulbs are lit up green. So each light bulb, as temporal succession and temporal becoming takes place via the A theory of time, each red light bulb turns blue, and then in turn when it's present, and then turns green as it turns into the past. So in this way, he has an A theory and a B theory, because all of the future events, past events, present events exist, ontologically speaking, but there's also an ontological distinction between present, past, and future bulbs, i.e., events, and that takes place in the analogy through the light bulbs, the color of the light bulbs that they're lit up. Now, in order to understand, well, why is this a problem, one has to understand that really McTaggart's view here makes intrinsic change impossible. It's logically impossible on this view, because any given light bulb will have simultaneously, it will have the properties of pastness, or the color green, presentness, or blueness, and futurity, or redness, simultaneously. And this is a logical contradiction. It has the property of not being red and being red at the same time, not being blue and being blue at the same time, not being green and being green at the same time, i.e., being past, not being past, being present, not being present, and being future and not being future. So in other words, look, if a given event E, if a given light bulb, like the quote-unquote present light bulb, turning blue is perceived in the present at time 1, but is also the same identical event remembered at time 2, then how can E possess different properties or tenses at time 1 and at time 2 and still be identical? This violates the logical law of identity. Obviously at time 2, one would be quote unquote remembering an entirely different event at time 1, and thus intrinsic change through time, from red to blue to green is impossible. And hence, this is how the McTaggart's paradox arises. Of course, it's based on this faulty understanding, though, because there is a third option that totally bypasses this, and that's the true A theory of time, which entails presentism. So presentism, remember, that's the view that virtually all A theorists of time hold to today, where it just says there is no future events, past events don't exist, ontologically speaking. Only the present event or moment exists. So, the only temporal entities that have an ontological existence on presentism are those that are quote unquote present. So this totally bypasses the contradiction or the paradox that McTaggart averts to here. So it totally averts this argument. Really, we should change premise number 2 to include, look, events cannot be past, present, and future unless either one, events are past, present, future only in virtue of their relation to other events, the B theory option, or 2, that events are past, present, and future in a hypertime, out to infinity, hypertime, hypertime, and so on and so forth, that vicious infinite regress, or 3, that presentism is true, namely only the present events exist, and events that are past or future only exist in the sense that they were and or will be present. So that's the third option, and that totally gets us off the hook and averts McTaggart's paradox. So therefore, this argument just is not applicable to the truth of the A theory and or to the falsity of the A theory and or to the truth of the B theory as a result. So yeah, let's move on to the fourth and final pro B theory argument. Once again, this argument will be namely trying to show that the A theory is false, and that since the B theory is the only viable alternative to the A theory, then the B theory must be true. And this argument is called the myth of time's passage and endurance of now argument. So let's take a look at that. So this argument, I'm kind of cheating. I'm smuggling in 2 arguments for the price of 1 here. So really there's 2 separate arguments, the myth of time's passage, and then there's the endurance of now arguments. But they're related, and we'll see why I combine them into one argument here. So in the first place, focusing on the myth of time's passage. So we all have common expressions about time flowing or time passing, So McTaggart, for example, he stated this, quote unquote, look, the movement of time consists in the fact that later and later terms pass into the present. So they exist ontologically, the future events, and they flow or pass into presentness. Or rather, presentness passes to later and later terms. So there's this kind of, it exists and it's like a wave, it flows out. Presentness kind of flows out and overcomes the future events, making them present, and or vice versa, that the future events are flowing backwards and flowing into presentness or something like that. So under this view, temporal becoming is said to be an objective or mind-independent thing, and it implies a real objective passage of time, like those waves passing over things and into presentness and that sort of thing. And it flows, so to speak. So this argument can be formulated into logically deductive format with 2 premises. So premise number 1, if the dynamic theory of time is true, then time's passage or flow is a mind-independent objective reality. Premise number 2, time's passage or flow cannot be a mind-independent or objective reality. Conclusion, therefore the dynamic theory of time is not true. Now, obviously this is a valid argument, so what remains is, are the premises logically sound? In the first place, the first premise right off the bat is obviously false. Remember, how do we escape this? So McTaggart is envisioning, it's kind of like the waves of the future exist ontologically on parity with the present, and they're flowing backwards into presentness, or vice versa. Presentness is, the future events exist, and presentness is flowing into them, into the future events, and turning them into present. That's just false. Presentism destroys this argument, because this premise, because the A theory entails presentism. There is no future. That doesn't exist. No, the present isn't flowing into the future, and or the future isn't flowing into the past. There's just the present. That's all that exists. There is no past or future events that exist, ontologically speaking. And bada boom, bada bing, you've destroyed this argument right then and there. It's just not applicable. In the same way McTaggart's paradox doesn't apply to true A theory, or the A theory of time proper, which entails presentism. This argument doesn't apply either. So when we use terms like time flies when you're having fun, or time flows, or time's passage, really we're just using these words. As A.N. Pryor gave an accurate description when describing the A theory, he just says, look, the flow or passage of time is just a metaphor, referring neither to genuine motion nor genuine change, but instead merely to the objectivity of tensed facts. It's a metaphor for tensed facts. That's all it is when we use this metaphorical language about time flowing or time's passage and stuff like that. So yeah, the B theorist is just taking us too literalistically in that case, and they're not really attacking the true A theory of time for what it is. They're attacking it based on a straw man. However, with this argument here, there does come up an additional problem, or another argument that does apply to the true A theorist, someone who holds to presentism, and that's what I'm calling this endurance of now problem. Basically, the question is, okay, if we're denying the reality of temporal passage or flow as a literal ontological thing, then that just means only the present exists. Great, I'll grant you that. But what is the durational extent of the present? What is the endurance of this now moment? How is it 2 seconds, 5 years? What equals the present? What kind of interval of time exists? Now think about this for a second. If only the present exists, then the past and future events are unreal. It's almost like reality seems to be reduced to a literal instant in time. Time is made up of various instants, present instants within time. But a problem arises then on that case, because number one, instants by definition have a zero duration. So how can it be said for things to exist for a zero temporal duration, for a temporal instant? That just doesn't make sense, and you get into issues of Zeno's paradox and that sort of thing, and an infinite number of temporal instants lasting for a zero temporal duration, and that just can't exist. We know that doesn't make sense. It can only ever be potentially infinite in the first place. But if that's the case, well then how can a potentially infinite series of durationless temporal instants ever add up to a non-zero interval? They just can't. And that's where this problem comes in. So some of the solutions, what are some of the solutions that A theorists have given to address this endurance of now problem? Well, one of the solutions that some philosophers of time and A theorists have come up with is one that I've already kind of hinted at. It's just to simply deny that basically the A theory of time and the notion of temporal becoming entails a continuous process involving temporal instants. So someone like Alfred North Whitehead, he made this argument, for example. He just denies, no, there are no such things as temporal instants. There isn't time on the A theory. It isn't like a continuous process of temporal instants, of non-zero duration temporal moments or something like that. Instead, time is what he called, quote unquote, atomistic in nature. So time itself is composed or made up of a series of finite, discrete temporal intervals, and he called these chronons. And it is really these chronons that is composing time, that time is composed of itself. In terms of, okay, well, a temporal interval, what is that? How long is that? So that's a question that nobody knows. So in terms of human beings, it's been psychologically proven that the present time interval for human beings psychologically is about 2 seconds. That's the present. Every 2 seconds we enter, okay, now I'm in the future. Now now this is a new present moment and stuff like that. I tried looking. I read that years ago, and I tried looking for the source, but I couldn't find it to include. But if there's any psychologists listening, maybe you can let me know. I remember reading years ago that psychologically speaking, for human beings, the present is a time interval of 2 seconds. But yeah, so obviously 2 seconds wouldn't constitute the present, but what would it be? And we just have no idea. What is the temporal duration of a chronon? Is it 1 second? Is it 10 milliseconds? 5 nanoseconds? Who knows? But whatever it is, the point is to avoid this problem, the solution is there are chronons and there's a temporal interval, finite temporal intervals that defines the present. Now, the problem with this view, though, is that it makes reality discontinuous or jerky. It's kind of like the frames of a movie picture, right? Those are discontinuous, but it's moving so fast that we get the illusion that, oh, it's a one continuous image in front of my eyeballs, when it's really not. It's really discontinuous. There's one frame, then another frame, then another frame, and it jumps from frame to frame just in rapid succession. Creating an illusion of a continuous image. Well, one could say, well, it's the same with chronons. They're so small, that the temporal intervals are so small, it's like 2 nanoseconds, that human beings are just oblivious. They can't see the jerkiness. It goes so fast that it looks continuous when it's really not. But I think that's a problem for the chronon view, this literal leaps in time that would have to take place, and these causal gaps that would result. I find this view problematic, to say the least, and I think that we have this from our own phenomenological experience of temporal succession. We know in this properly basic way it is smooth and continuous. It's not jerky and discontinuous, and it doesn't entail leaps or gaps and stuff like that. So I reject this solution, but just wanted to make you aware of the chronon thesis of Alfred North Whitehead to solve this endurance and now problem. Okay, well, what is the solution that I go for then as an atheist? How do I answer the question of what is the endurance of now? Well, going back to remembering Zeno's paradox, I think the true solution is just to deny that the present is a metrical concept in the first place. The present moment or time is not inherently metrical by itself. Or left to its own. It is purely duration. That's what time is. It's just pure, unadulterated, or undivided duration. That is what constitutes absolute time. It is conceptually prior to any divisions or intervals that we would make or carve up into it, like 1 second or an interval of 1 hour and stuff like that. Time or pure duration is prior to that. And if you remember, we kind of hinted at that above. It's the same answer we give to avoid the actual infinities entailed by an infinite number of intervals in between the halfway point of a stadium. How can we traverse an actual infinite number of points or intervals to get to the halfway line of a stadium? Well, number one, it's a potential infinite, but it's also this point that, look, the distance or the halfway point is conceptually prior to any of the divisions that we make into it. So the metrical divisions of here's the quarter of the stadium mark, the 1/8 mark, the blah 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 1/25th and 5 centimeter and blah blah blah. That can potentially go on forever, but that only comes about logically after or posterior to the concept of a whole. So it's kind of like, picture a ruler. The ruler just exists. It's a blank ruler or measuring stick, as British people call it apparently, and there's nothing on it. And then we paint on the divisions or the 1 centimeter interval, the 2 5 centimeter intervals and stuff like that. But the ruler itself, the blank ruler, before those lines are painted on it, it just exists conceptually prior. And that's what we're saying here. Time just exists as pure, simple duration, and only afterwards do we paint onto it metrical intervals that we can measure, like the 1 hour, 1 second, 1 millisecond, stuff like that. So that's really the true answer to avoid this endurance of now problem. That's the one that I personally go for and think is correct. Dr. William Lane Craig goes for this answer as well, and most people use this answer, most philosophers use this answer in defeating Zeno's paradoxes. I'm just applying that to the issue of time and the endurance of now problem. So yeah, just the metric concepts or the intervals of time are merely secondary constructions that we put on pure duration or absolute time. So yeah, I think that covers everything in terms of the four arguments for the B theory of time. You'll see in my write-up, I think that all of these arguments are failures to varying degrees. They're 50% or less proven. But just for the fun of it and for the sake of charity for the atheists and skeptics, or the atheists and skeptics against my own second philosophical argument, I assumed a 95% proven level for each of the four arguments in favor of the B theory to hurt my argument, which requires the truth of the A theory. And it still came out to 82% proven when I factored in all of the positive evidences in favor of the A theory factors, and then assumed 95% proven for all of the B3 arguments. I still got 82% proven that the A theory of time is true. And you can see that in my write-up in terms of the specific numbers I give and how I calculate that in terms of Bayes' theorem to get an overall cumulative probability value based on my individual normative values in arriving at the truth that premise number 3 is true, proven to an 82% proven level. So yeah, multiplying that together. So for premise number 1, I assigned a 95% proven, if you'll remember. Premise number 2 was 100% proven. And then premise number 3, that the A theory of time is true, was 82% proven as a worst case charitable number, trying to help out the atheists and skeptics as much as I can. And therefore multiplied across, so that is a total of 77.9% proven that universe would entail a temporal regress of past events, and that it constitutes an actual infinite form through successive addition, which is logically impossible. As such, our actual universe cannot be eternal, and it therefore it began to exist, meaning that it is therefore contingent by definition. Yeah, that's it for this part. Next time, I did promise Chris Date I was going to get into God's relationship to time, the philosophical arguments for God's relationship to time. But I think I'm actually going to hold off to that, and instead of doing that as an excursus, I'm going to leave that to the end and do that as an addendum argument after I'm finished with the cosmological argument, because I really want to get the cosmological argument completed for you guys. I've been promising for months. So the next show is going to be part 3, where we're going to address the scientific evidence, the empirical evidence, both from the expansion of the universe and the second law of thermodynamics. And then I'm going to apply that into my own format, into an inductive argument or an abductive argument, whereby we make an inference to the best explanation, trying to prove that the universe began to exist scientifically using inductive inference criteria to the best explanation. So yeah, look out for that next time, and I hope you guys enjoyed. This was quite long, so all right, have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.